The morning Gerald Maddox was let go from the Mercer County Surveyor's office, the sky looked like it had been wrung out and hung across the hills to dry a colorless March ceiling so low it seemed to press the rooftops down another inch. Rain was not falling so much as hanging in the air, unable to decide between precipitation and permanent residence. And the parking lot outside the county building had the particular gloss of wet asphalt that Gerald associated with early spring in western Pennsylvania, a gloss that made the white paint lines shimmer, and the Orange County trucks looked like they were sinking into the blacktop by fractions of an inch every hour. Three of those trucks were already gone, sold downstate in January. The remaining four sat with their cones stacked and their tripods leaning against the tailgates, like tools waiting for hands that had already waved goodbye. Gerald carried a cardboard box across that lot at 8:45, walking at the pace he had maintained for 19 years of government fieldwork, in weather that ranged from brutal to merely unpleasant, a pace that did not change for good days or bad for July, when the road shoulders radiated enough heat to cook an egg on the hood of his truck, or for January when the creek banks froze into crusts that shattered under his boot heels like dinner plates dropped on tile. He moved through the world at one speed. June and his wife called it his best quality. She also called it his worst. She usually said both things in the same sentence, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, watching him tie his boots with the meticulous deliberation of a man diffusing an explosive device, double knotting each lace, checking the tension with his thumbs. Because sloppiness in small things was the first symptom of sloppiness in large things. And Gerald Maddox had never been sloppy about a single thing in his 52 years on Earth. Inside the box were his field books, 7 of them cloth-covered with spines cracked by weather, and pages that had been soaked and dried and soaked again so many times they held a permanent wave, each sheet curling gently at the edges, the way a leaf curls when it has given up on flatness. The entries inside were written in 2H mechanical pencil, the hardest lead that still left a visible mark, chosen specifically because it did not smear in the rain, that came sideways off the hills every March, did not fade in the August sun, that turned the blacktop to taffy and the air above it to a shimmering curtain of heat, did not bleed when a drop of sweat fell from the bridge of Gerald's nose onto the page during a summer survey along a road shoulder where the nearest shade was a quarter-mile walk back to the truck. He bought his lead in boxes of 12 from the office supply store on Elm Street, run by a man named Horvath, who kept the good leads behind the counter because they were small enough to pocket, and Gerald replaced them every 8 weeks with a regularity that Horvath could have calibrated a clock by. 3 mechanical pencils, each sharpened that morning at 7:15 on the sandpaper pad he kept in his top desk drawer. The lead rotated a quarter turn with each stroke until the point was symmetrical and fine enough to represent on paper the legal boundary between one man's property and another man's pride. He had sharpened them out of habit. The habit did not know this was the last time it would be performed in this building. Habits do not read termination letters. They fire on schedule until the schedule no longer exists, and even then they echo in the muscle memory of a man's hands for weeks afterward, the fingers reaching for a drawer that is no longer there, the thumb testing a point that no longer needs testing. A coffee mug, white, blue stripe, a chip on the rim that faced away from his mouth, which meant, in Gerald's assessment, that the mug was cosmetically imperfect, but functionally intact, a distinction he had been defending against June's campaign to throw it away since 1987. 7 years of daily argument conducted not in words, but in the quiet persistence of a man who continued to drink from a chipped mug and a woman who continued to suggest alternatives. June had given him the mug on his first day at the county office, wrapped in tissue paper, with a note tucked inside measure twice, and come home safe. He had carried that note in his wallet until the folds wore through and the ink became a ghost of itself, and then he placed it in a drawer at home beneath a rejection letter from a bank because Gerald Maddox kept things. Everything in an order that existed nowhere except the interior architecture of his own mind. An architecture that was as precise and as navigable as any survey map he had ever drawn, and that no other human being could read. A photograph. June and Claire at the county fair, 1990, taped to the inside of his locker door. Claire was 6, riding Gerald's shoulders with a cotton candy in her right hand and her left hand clamped on his forehead with the unyielding grip of a child who has achieved the highest available vantage point and intends to defend it against all forces, including gravity. June was laughing. Head tilted back, eyes almost shut. The gap between her front teeth visible, the gap she covered in formal photographs but forgot about. When joy got the better of self-consciousness, and the forgetting was what made the photograph honest, because honesty in a photograph is not a matter of composition or lighting, but of the subject forgetting that a camera exists and simply being alive. Gerald's face was mostly hidden behind Claire's hand, but his eyes were visible above her fingers, and his eyes were looking at June. Not at the camera, at June. They were the eyes of a man who recognizes the best moment of his day while it is happening, rather than in retrospect, a man who has the sense to look at the thing worth looking at instead of the lens that wants to record it. A 50-foot steel tape wound tight, smelling of oil and metal, and the fine brown dust of 10,000 measurements in 10,000 locations over 2 decades. That tape had settled boundary disputes through blackberry thickets and frozen creek beds in courthouse hallways where lawyers in polished shoes moved at twice Gerald's pace and arrived at the same door at the same time because Gerald's pace was efficient, even when it did not look fast. The way a river that appears slow can carry a log from one bend to the next without ever pausing to explain itself. Gerald was 48. He had started at 29, a young man from a dairy farm in Crawford County, where his father kept cattle and raised hay, and fixed every broken thing with his own hands and a toolbox that lived in the barn beside a workbench with a cast iron vise. His father did not teach with words. He taught with demonstrations. He demonstrated how to sharpen a blade by sharpening a blade, how to set a post by setting a post, how to endure cold by enduring cold. And underneath all of these demonstrations, never stated, because it did not need to be stated, ran the single conviction that organized Gerald's father's entire existence: a man is worth what he does when nobody is watching and nobody will thank him. Gerald had risen from rodman to senior surveyor through the accumulation of competence so steady and so unremarkable that nobody noticed it happening until it had already happened, the way nobody notices a river deepening its channel until one day the water is 3 feet lower than anyone remembers, and the old bridge pilings are exposed like the bones of an earlier time. He was the man the county sent when the boundary dispute was violent, when the landowners were threatening each other with shotguns or lawsuits, or both, when someone needed to stand between two furious men and point at a line in the ground and say, "This is where your property ends," with the kind of calm authority that made both men stop shouting, not because they agreed, but because they could feel in Gerald's voice the presence of a fact, and facts are the only things in the world that do not flinch. The state cut the county budget by 11%. The commissioners outsourced surveying to a private firm from Scranton that bid 40% lower and would send younger men who earned less and carried none of the institutional memory that Gerald and the other men over 50 had accumulated across a combined 60 years of reading the county's ground. The termination letter was one paragraph. It thanked Gerald for his service and wished him well in his future endeavors. Gerald placed it in the box with the other objects of his professional life and carried it across the parking lot at the pace he carried everything, and the word endeavors sat in that sentence like a splinter under a fingernail, impossible to forget, impossible to remove without drawing blood. He sat in his truck without starting the engine. A sparrow worked the curb near the storm drain. Gerald watched it because watching required nothing, and he needed in this particular minute to do something that cost nothing. Then he turned the key and drove home. The house on Sycamore Road had clapboard siding that had been white in 1986 and was now the color of old cream, weathered at the corners, peeling near the windowsills, where moisture collected in winter and baked dry in summer in the endless cycle that eventually defeats every coat of paint applied to every wooden surface in the northeastern United States. The gravel driveway was 110 feet long. Gerald knew because he had measured it, not for any reason, except that measuring was what Gerald did the way breathing was what Gerald did, without deciding to, without being able to stop. The gravel made a different sound under every vehicle. His truck had a steady crunch. June's wagon had a lighter patter. A stranger's car had a hesitation in it, a slower approach, the sound of unfamiliarity, and Gerald could identify a vehicle by its gravel signature from inside the house with the windows closed. The barn behind the house had been red and was now the color of dried blood. Inside it, a workbench built by Gerald's father, the cast iron vise, a hand plane sharpened every March, whether needed or not, cans of chain oil arranged by height. And hanging from a nail-in-the-wall stud, a brush hook with an ash handle darkened by 2 generations of hands, the blade curved and heavy and sharp enough to take a sapling in one swing. This tool would become the most important object in Gerald Maddox's life, but that was 23 years away. The porch light was on, 2 in the afternoon. July or January noon or midnight, the porch light was always on. June had been turning it on since the first year of their marriage and had never stopped because the light was not about illumination. It was about presence. It said the house was occupied. It said someone was expected. It said come home. June saw the box through the kitchen window before she saw his face. She held the screen door open and said nothing. 22 years of marriage had made her fluent in Gerald's silences, the way a musician is fluent in the rest between notes. This silence was heavy, the silence of a man carrying something too large for words and too settled for argument. Gerald set the box on the kitchen table. Heavy oak. Estate sale, 1980, $60. The surface was scarred with decades of other people's meals, and Gerald and June's own 20 years of coffee cups and newspapers and maps and conversations and silences, and the long scratch from the evening. Gerald unspooled his steel tape across its surface to verify a measurement that had been bothering him since 3 o'clock. June looked at the contents. Field books, pencils, mug, photograph. She picked up the photograph and held it a moment. She did not cry. June was not a woman who cried at the first sign of difficulty or the 5th or the 15th. She was a woman who assessed, who measured a situation the way Gerald measured a boundary, carefully, without rushing before deciding what to do. I will make coffee, she said. For 3 weeks, Gerald sat on the porch every morning and watched fog lift off the fields east of Route 9. The fog was as readable to him as a map. The lowest layer followed the drainage ditches and creek beds with the slow, white viscosity of something poured. The middle layer softened fence posts and tree lines into suggestions of themselves. The upper layer caught the early sunlight for exactly long enough to turn the color of pearl before dissolving. By 8, the fields were clear and the day was ordinary. He did not look for work. The classifieds June placed beside his coffee each Thursday folded to the employment listings relevant column, circled lightly in pencil at untouched and all day, and vanished each Friday, replaced by the next edition. Neither mentioned it. It was a conversation conducted entirely in newsprint in silence. What Gerald was doing, though, it looked like nothing was the most important work of his life. He was replaying 19 years of surveys in his head, every boundary walked, every deed discrepancy flagged and told to ignore, every parcel that did not match its map. 20 years of reading the physical ground had deposited in his memory a picture of the county's land history that no other living person possessed. The paper said one thing, the ground said another. The places where they disagreed were where the value lived. June broke the silence with a laminated card placed beside his coffee one morning 3 weeks in. Gerald C. Maddox, Mercer County Public Library. She had walked to the library that morning while he watched fog. Go read something. Hands folded at her waist, chin raised. The particular set of her shoulders that meant the decision was final. You are best when you are searching. Gerald picked up the card, turned it over, looked at her. She held his gaze with the steady, unhurried certainty of a woman who had loved a quiet man for 22 years and who understood that quiet men do not need instructions. They need starting points. That afternoon, he drove to the Mercer County Public Library on Elm Street. Limestone building, 1914. Tall windows, front door that stuck in humidity and had to be shouldered open, which Gerald appreciated because he did not trust places that yielded too easily. The reading room had a long oak table under the east windows, 6 scarred wooden chairs and a ceiling fan on its lowest setting, producing a movement of air detectable only by the faint trembling of an open page. The librarian was Mrs. Ewell, thin, reading glasses on a beaded chain, voice at a permanent whisper. She stopped asking Gerald what he was looking for after the 3rd Tuesday. She learned his pace, his system, his chronological progression through the county's archives, and she began placing the next volume on his table before he arrived, because anticipation was her version of hospitality, and silence was his version of gratitude, and the arrangement suited them both. He came every Tuesday for 2 years. Plat books, zoning records, title abstracts, tax maps, rail corridor filings, cloth-bound volumes with linen pages and ink stamps fading from black to the color of weak tea. He did not miss once. Not for illness, not for weather, not for the ice storm in February 1995 that closed schools and killed power for 36 hours on the east side. Gerald walked 2 miles through that storm because his truck would not start, arrived at 9:15 instead of 9, and sat down at his table and removed his gloves and opened the volume as though walking through an ice storm to read a 90-year-old land record was the most reasonable use of a Tuesday morning. He was not looking for anything specific. He was listening to the land the way a mechanic listens to an engine, not for one knock, but for the rhythm underneath the pattern that tells you something is misaligned before the part fails. Every time the county rezoned a corridor, they filed a new survey. They never checked the old one. They laid the new map on top of the old map, the way you throw a new sheet over old bedding, covering whatever was underneath without lifting a corner. Rights granted in 1912 could lie beneath a 1936 rezoning, beneath a 1983 rail abandonment, beneath a 2004 tax seizure, and nobody would know. The county assumed the developers checked. The developers assumed the title attorneys checked. The title attorneys assumed the county had already checked. Assumption on assumption, like the maps, each one burying what lay beneath. February 1996, Tuesday, Plat Book 19, page 114. 7 lines of handwritten ink in a slanting, careful hand that had learned penmanship in the previous century. Faded to the color of weak tea. Notarized by a county clerk named T.R. Fenton on April 3, 1912. A perpetual rite of passage along a strip of land 12 feet wide and approximately half a mile long, running northeast from a parcel near Route 9 to the Mercer River. Perpetual. Gerald read the word 3 times. Perpetual meant what it had always meant. Forever. Unless someone filed a dissolution and a court granted it. He checked the 1956 rezoning. No dissolution. The 1983 abandonment. No dissolution. The 2004 records. No dissolution. 84 years. Not one filing had acknowledged the clause. Not one had moved to dissolve it. The right-of-way had been sitting in this book alive, valid and visible, since Woodrow Wilson was president. Gerald closed the book, returned it to Mrs. Ewell, walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel for 60 seconds. That evening, he spread a county map across the kitchen table, drew a single line in ballpoint from Route 9 northeast to the river. The line bisected the rail corridor. It crossed every parcel rezoned in 1956. It crossed the only feasible path for an access road into the corridor. June set a coffee cup beside the map. What is that line? A right-of-way. 1812. Nobody filed against it. June sat down. She did not ask anything else. She knew the difference between a man who had found something interesting and a man who had found something that would rearrange the rest of his life. Gerald talked about the interesting things. He went silent about the ones that mattered. Over the months that followed, Gerald watched. Saturday mornings along Route 9, windows down, orange survey flags appeared in the weeds new and bright, then tire tracks in the mud, then white panel vans with no markings. He checked deed transfers at the county clerk's office. 3 LLCs, same address in Philadelphia. Corridor Land Associates, Mercer Rail Holdings, Quarter Development, LLC. He tracked every purchase in a small green notebook June had given him for his birthday. Mechanical pencil, parcel numbers, dates, prices, margin notes in his careful hand, approaching adjacent not yet. By summer of 1996, someone was assembling land along the rail corridor from both ends buying toward the center. The center contained a 1.7-acre parcel on the county's delinquent tax roll. The 12-foot strip from 1912 ran directly through the only possible access road. Not beside it, through it. The tax auction was held in the basement of the Mercer County Courthouse on a Saturday in late July. Limestone building Main Street, clock tower frozen at 2:17. Fluorescent lights humming above rows of folding chairs. The room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet and the particular institutional basement dampness of 70 years of limestone sweat. Gerald wore his canvas jacket and work boots. Bank envelope, $800 cash. Back row, hands folded, watching. Edna Prewitt was there, retired schoolteacher, 71 cardigan, and orthopedic shoes, who attended every auction because she believed in knowing what the county did with public land. A married couple for Parcel 3, and Russell Flagg, regional manager, Mercer National Bank, sport coat and pressed slacks in a room of folding chairs. legal pad on one knee, the posture of a man who had decided early that appearance was a form of authority and who had never encountered evidence to the contrary, or at least no evidence he was willing to accept. In 1991, Gerald had applied for a $22,000 business loan at Russell's bank, enough to go independent as a surveyor. Russell held the application the way a man holds a menu he intends to send back. Risk profile is unfavorable. One paragraph. Gerald carried that letter for 3 months. He did not forget the word unfavorable. He did not forget the sound of a door closing inside a sentence. Parcel 7, 1.7 acres. No road frontage. No structures. Seasonal standing water. 3 prior auctions without a bid. Gerald raised his hand. Sold. $79.90. Russell Flagg turned around and laughed. Not a quiet laugh. The kind that has a point to it. The kind that fills a room of cinder block and folding chairs and lingers in the fluorescent air after the man who made it has stopped. That is swamp brush in a drainage ditch, Gerald. What are you going to do with it? Build a castle. Gerald folded the receipt, slid it into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket, stood, walked out into the afternoon sun without looking back. Because Gerald had already been to the clerk's office 4 times. He had already read the 1912 filing. He had already drawn the line on the map at his kitchen table. He had already verified that the 1.7 acres sat directly on top of a right-of-way clause that had been alive, valid, and invisible for 84 years. A clause that could halt any construction that needed to cross those 12 feet between Route 9 and the river. He was not going to tell a living soul until the day it mattered. He drove home. June at the window. He came up the porch steps with something in his face she had not seen since the day he brought the box home. Not happiness, not triumph, purpose. Green notebook. Date, parcel number, price. One word. Acquired. June placed her hand on the table, palm up. Gerald placed his over hers. They sat that way while the afternoon light moved across the map and the ink line in their joined hands, and neither spoke because between them the silence had always been enough. The waiting began. Not the passive waiting of a man who has nothing to do, but the active, disciplined waiting of a man who has everything to do and has decided to do it slowly over years at the pace the situation demands rather than the pace his mind prefers. Gerald's mind preferred speed. That was the part of the story nobody would ever understand, the part they would fill in with their own assumptions, the way the county filled in its maps with assumptions, layering what they believed on top of what they did not bother to check. People who heard about Gerald Maddox later, people who read the article in the Herald, or who heard the story from Edna Pruitt or Duff Kinney at the feed store, or from any of the 100 small channels through which information moves in a county, where everyone has known everyone else for 50 years, those people assumed Gerald had always been patient, that the patience was innate, a feature of the original equipment, the way some men are born tall or left-handed. They were wrong. Gerald had learned patience the way he learned surveying, through repetition, through failure, through the slow process of doing something badly, and then doing it less badly, and then doing it adequately, and then doing it well enough that people forgot there had been a time when he could not do it at all. The patience was built, not born, constructed over decades from the raw materials of a temperament that was in its natural state anything but patient. As a young man, Gerald had been restless, not dramatically, internally. The restlessness of a mind that processed faster than the world moved and that experienced the gap between its own speed and the world's speed as a physical sensation, a tightness behind the sternum that he would later recognize as the early form of the impatience that would have ruined him if left uncorrected. He wanted things to be right immediately. When they were not right immediately, the tightness appeared, and the tightness was the signal of a man fighting the fundamental truth that reality does not accelerate because you need it to. His father corrected it, not with a speech, with a fence post. January in Crawford County. Gerald was 12, temperature 14 degrees. The ground was frozen to a depth that made each strike of the post hole digger feel like hitting concrete with a spoon. His father worked the digger 1 inch per strike, each blow producing less progress than the mine wanted, and more than the previous blow had suggested was possible. They had been working 2 hours. 3 posts set. Gerald wanted to be done. He wanted to be inside. He wanted to be anywhere other than standing in a field in January watching a man who did not seem to notice the cold or the slowness or the gap between what had been accomplished and what remained. Gerald said something about going in faster. He does not remember the exact words. He remembers his father stopping, setting the digger down, looking at him with the calm assessment of a man who has worked land for 30 years and has learned things from it that cannot be communicated in a sentence, but can sometimes be communicated in a look. His father picked up the digger, struck, 1 inch, struck again, 1 inch, hit a rock, pulled the digger out, looked at the rock, angled the digger left, struck. The ground gave. He worked around the rock the way water works around a stone in a creek, not by force, but by finding the path the obstacle provides, because no resistance is total, no obstacle is complete, and the man who keeps striking will find the gap that the man who quits will never see. Gerald picked up his own digger, struck, 1 inch, struck again, 1 inch, and something shifted inside him, not a revelation, but a recalibration, a willingness to accept that 1 inch was enough if 1 inch was what the ground would give, and that the fence would be finished when the fence was finished, and that steadiness was worth more than speed, because speed gets the post in the ground, but steadiness keeps it there. That lesson took 40 years to complete. It was not finished at the fence line or the surveyor's office or the library. It was finished on the porch on a warm evening, 23 years after the purchase, when Gerald sat with his coffee and listened to machines building a $36 million project on his 12-foot strip and felt no restlessness at all. The tightness behind the sternum was gone. The gap between his mind's speed and the world's speed had closed. Not because the world sped up, because Gerald finally learned to work at the speed of the ground. His father would have nodded once and gone back to work. Every spring, first week of April, Gerald wrote a check to the county assessor. $14.20. Same week every year he walked the 12-foot strip with his father's brush hook. He cleared the saplings that had grown since the previous April, pulled migrating wire fence from adjacent properties, checked the 2 survey stakes he had driven himself. In 1998, thick steel posts hammered 3 inches below grade at the northeast and southwest corners of the strip. He verified they were plumb. He logged everything in the green notebook. Date, work performed, condition of strip, stake condition, drainage, vegetation, mechanical pencil, 2H, the kind that does not fade and cannot be challenged as altered. He never missed a year. Nobody asked him. Nobody watched. Nobody knew except June, who saw him leave with the brush hook each April and return with sawdust on his cuffs and the smell of cut wood on his jacket, and who never asked why, because asking would have implied she did not understand, and June understood everything about Gerald Maddox, including the things he had not yet told her. 23 pages eventually. 23 Aprils. 23 records of a man showing up to maintain land that the county had forgotten the developers had not discovered and the world considered worthless. Gerald was building something in that notebook. He did not know what. He did not know when he would need it. He built it anyway. The way a man stacks firewood in July. Winter always comes. The man who has wood does not explain why he spent the summer cutting it. The first offer arrived in the fall of 2002. Nolan Corrado, approximately 30. Silver sedan, spotless showroom bright tires that would not survive 200 yards of Mercer County gravel. Dark blue suit, pocket square, a leather portfolio with a gold clasp. Shoes already dusty from the 32 feet between his car and the porch, a distance Gerald knew because he had measured it in 1985, when he considered pouring a concrete path that he never poured because gravel worked fine, and $400 was $400. A man whose shoes cannot handle a gravel driveway is a man who does not understand the first thing about land. June was in the living room with a library novel, turning a page, slowly listening. June could absorb every word of a conversation occurring 2 rooms away and reproduce it afterward with the fidelity of a recording device, a talent Gerald had tested once by asking her about something a plumber said in the kitchen while she was reading in the bedroom, and she quoted the man verbatim, including his stammer and his mispronunciation of the word gasket. Corrado showed Gerald a map, colored parcels, green for acquired, yellow for pending. Gerald's parcel shaded red, the only red. $8,000. Number. 1 word. No negotiating posture. No counter. the flat final syllable of a man who decided years before this conversation began. Corrado left a business card on the railing. 2 springs later, it was still there, bleached white, curled by frost, no longer an object, but weather. June swept it off with the dead leaves. In 2007, the county asked Gerald to voluntarily release his parcel for a greenway corridor. 2 pages. Community benefit mentioned 4 times. A dedication plaque offered. The 1912 clause not mentioned because nobody at the Planning Commission knew it existed. Gerald wrote back 6 words: "I respectfully decline." Between these events, Gerald's father died. Gerald drove to Crawford County for the funeral and stood at the grave and said nothing, and drove home and sat on the porch and said nothing, and went to bed and said nothing. And June lay beside him and held his hand and said nothing because the silence they had built over 26 years could carry grief as effectively as language, and with considerably more dignity. The inheritance was the tools: brush, hook, hand plane, vise. Gerald already had them. He had taken them years earlier with his father's silent consent because tools go to the hands that know them. In October of 2010, June sat down at the kitchen table after dinner and could not breathe. Gerald heard behind him the sound that is the opposite of breathing, the rapid, shallow pulling at air through a passage that has become too narrow, and he turned and saw her gripping the table edge, knuckles white face, the color of ash, not pale but gray, the color of something that is losing what gives it color. He did not ask if she was all right. He could see she was not. He dried his hands on the towel, walked her to the truck, drove to Mercer General in the dark. Congestive heart failure. Ejection fraction 55%. Manageable but not reversible. The cardiologist was a young woman named Kessler who spoke in clean sentences without padding. Gerald held those words the way he held measurements. Manageable meant livable. Not reversible meant permanent. June from the hospital bed, smaller than he had ever seen her. "Do not even think about selling that land because of me." The bills came like weather. Co-pays, specialists, cardiac monitoring. Gerald fell behind on medical payments, then utilities, then insurance. Pink-windowed envelopes arrived. June saw them because June walked to the mailbox slowly, now gripping the railing. Duff Kinney came by on a Saturday in February 2011, cap in his hands. He said what he had rehearsed in his truck. "Why are you sitting on worthless land while your wife needs medicine? You are not a stupid man, Gerald, but you are being a stubborn one, and stubbornness is only a virtue when nobody pays the price for it but you, because it is not time." Duff shook his head, drove away. In bed that night, June's breathing thin beside him, Gerald said to the ceiling, "I could sell." June found his hand, fingers cool and thin and weaker than 6 months ago. "If you sell now, you will regret it every day you have left. I know you, Gerald. You do not quit things. Find another way." Second mortgage on the house, 7.2%. The house paid off in 2003. The house his father helped him buy in 1979. Everything stacked behind a 7990 receipt and a dead man's clause. If Gerald was wrong, they would lose the house. He told June enough. He did not tell her the interest rate. She nodded. She did not ask for numbers. She trusted him the way she had trusted him since 1972, with the tested certainty of a woman who had watched a man keep his word for 45 years. Karen Lyle, 2011. Black SUV, $45,000 on a single sheet of paper set on the kitchen table while June rested in the back bedroom, and the clock above the stove ticked louder than any clock Gerald had ever heard. Number. Because you need what is under the parcel more than you need the parcel. Claire traced the LLC registrations in 2012. 28 years old. Law degree from 2009. Property title work in Scranton. She called one evening Corridor Land Associates, Mercer Rail Holdings Quarter Development, all connected to Mercer Quarter investors. One limited partner, Russell Flagg. The banker who laughed, the man who said unfavorable, an investor in the project that could not proceed without crossing Gerald's strip. Bad news, June asked. Just confirmation. In 2016, the Development Authority announced the Mercer Quarter project. 14 acres, mixed use, $36 million. Glass buildings and tree-lined walkways, and a public plaza with a fountain. Diane Ashford, the project lead, told her team the corridor was clean. Brent Harlow, the title attorney, checked everything except the one thing that mattered. Nobody mentioned Plat Book 19 or page 114 or T.R. Fenton or the word perpetual. October 2018. Gerald walked the strip on schedule and found his stakes pulled. Clean holes, tire tracks from a heavy vehicle, construction debris dumped at the northeast end, broken concrete slabs, wire mesh roofing, shingles. Someone wanted the strip to look abandoned. 21 years of non-use was the legal threshold. Gerald was at 22 years of ownership, one documented year of apparent neglect, and they had a case. Gerald went to his truck for the disposable camera he had kept in the glove box since 2002, replacing it annually. He photographed the debris from 4 angles. The holes with his steel tape for scale, the tire tracks. He drove new stakes thicker, deeper flush, with the surface invisible unless you knew where to look. Impossible to pull without digging. Photographed those. Recorded everything in the notebook. Someone was nervous. Nervous people make mistakes that patient people document. March 2019, phone, area code 215, $420,000. One time. Clean transfer. 10 days to close. Number. June looked up from her paper. How much? Gerald told her. She nodded. Once. 23 years of watching her husband wait. She understood the wait was almost over. 2 weeks later, a blue Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper turned into the driveway. The gravel announced it differently from the sedans and SUVs that had come before. Lighter, faster, the rhythm of tires that knew every rut because they had been driving this driveway since the driver was 16. Claire Maddox, 35, her father's patience, her mother's stubbornness. 6 years of property title work in Scranton, specializing in transportation easements. She knew what a buried claim looked like. She knew buried claims do not expire. They wait. They sit in the records like seeds in frozen ground, alive, but dormant, capable of breaking through the surface the moment conditions change. And conditions always change because the land is permanent, but the plans of men are not. Gerald handed her the notebook, the manila folder from the filing cabinet, the original deed with the 1912 clause. She sat at the kitchen table and read for 40 minutes without speaking. 23 Aprils, 23 tax receipts, not one gap. She held the 1912 plat to the kitchen window and traced the 12-foot line with her finger, watching the faded ink hover in the light, the way her father had watched it in the library and the way a judge would watch it in 3 months. She placed her hands flat on the table. Dad, they cannot touch this. The Development Authority filed a motion for adverse abandonment. 16 pages, 3 rural precedents, no productive use in 21 years. The kind of motion that wins when nobody pushes back. Claire called Brent Harlow from the kitchen table. I have 23 years of consecutive tax payments, 23 years of dated maintenance logs in mechanical pencil, and 4 time-stamped photographs from October 2018 showing your client dumped construction debris and pulled survey stakes from the strip 6 months before filing this motion. I trust your client can explain the debris. I trust they can explain the tire tracks. I trust they can explain why stakes that were in place for 20 years disappeared within a year of your filing deadline. 11 seconds of silence. Claire counted. 11 seconds is an attorney discovering that his routine motion has become the most complicated problem of his career. The hearing was June 4th, 2019. Second floor. Same courthouse where Gerald bought swamp in the basement 23 years earlier. Morning light through tall windows, illuminating dust and turning the oak table the color of honey. Diane Ashford on one side with 2 attorneys and the composed expression of a woman expecting a quick outcome. Brent Harlow with a 3-inch file and a plan for lunch on Elm Street by noon. Gerald on the other side. White shirt ironed that morning while June watched from the bed. Canvas jacket. Receipt in the inside pocket softened by 23 years of being transferred pocket to pocket each wash. The carbon copy faded to gray, but the numbers legible. $79.90. Claire beside him in a gray blazer. Judge Whitfield, 60s, white-haired, 30 years on the bench. The particular attentiveness of a man who had learned that the cases that look smallest at the outset often turn out to carry the most weight. Claire placed 3 documents on the table. First, the certified 1912 plat, 12 feet wide, half a mile long. The word perpetual. No dissolution filing in 107 years. Second, the chain of failures. 1956, rezoning missed it. 1983, rail abandonment missed it. 2004, tax seizure missed it. The Development Authority's own title search missed it. Layer after layer, assumption after assumption. Third, 23 tax receipts stapled to 23 maintenance logs stapled to 4 photographs. Debris, holes, tire tracks, steel tape for scale. Your client's motion requires proof of abandonment. These documents are 23 years of proof of the opposite. Whitfield reviewed the materials for 9 minutes. He turned the notebook pages with the deliberate care of a man handling something that took a long time to build. He held the 1912 plat to the window. The light came through the linen paper and the ink appeared from behind, and for a moment the faded letters looked fresh, as if Fenton had written them that morning. The motion is denied. The right-of-way is valid and has been continuously maintained. The 1912 clause stands as recorded. Ashford collected her files and left. The door closed behind her with a sound that was neither loud nor soft, just final. Gerald stood, buttoned his jacket, paused at the stairwell to the basement. Same stairs he climbed 23 years earlier with a receipt in his pocket and laughter in his ears. The fluorescence still humming down there. He looked down the stairs for a moment. Then he turned and walked into the June sunlight. 2 weeks later, Harlow called Claire. Terms. Gerald's terms came from the kitchen table coffee cup beside the map that had lived under the sugar bowl since 1996 monthly payment, adjusted for inflation, transferable to heirs, recorded as a lien, 40-year minimum. No lump sum. I am not selling anything. I am letting them use what they should have found 23 years ago, and they will pay for the privilege every month for as long as the road exists. Harlow resisted inflation adjustment. No. Resisted lien recording. No. Resisted heir transfer. No. 40-year minimum. No. He accepted every term because he had no alternative. The access road could not exist without crossing Gerald's strip, and the strip belonged to Gerald Maddox. $4,100 a month, indexed to inflation. 40-year term, transferable to heirs. Good, Gerald said. One word. The word of a man who has never required validation and is not going to start requiring it now. June heard him come inside. She looked up from the newspaper. Did not ask. 45 years of his silences had made her fluent in all of them. She knew what this one contained. She put the kettle on. The signing was at the county clerk's office on a Thursday in August. Same building where T.R. Fenton stamped the original clause 107 years earlier. Different clerk, different stamp, same limestone walls. Gerald signed, Claire signed beside him. He folded his copy and slid it next to the receipt in his jacket pocket. 2 pieces of paper, 23 years apart. In the truck afterward, he opened the notebook. Last page. Mechanical pencil. Settled. Terms accepted. June was right. First payment arrived September 1st. That week, Gerald paid off the second mortgage. The house was his again. Russell Flagg read about it in the Sunday paper. 74, retired since 2014, lawn service on Thursdays. He read the name Gerald Maddox, and the memories arrived in sequence. Courthouse basement, canvas jacket, laughter, swamp brush, drainage ditch, castle. The man he had laughed at had been holding the key to Russell's largest investment for 23 years, and Russell had never known, and the not knowing was worse than the losing, because the not knowing meant that Russell Flagg's professional assessment of Gerald Maddox, the assessment that used the word unfavorable, had been the most catastrophically wrong judgment of his entire career, and the wrongness had been sitting in a plat book on a shelf in a public library where anyone with a library card and the patience to read could have found it at any time in 84 years, and nobody had except the man Russell had dismissed. He set the paper down. He looked at his lawn. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Edna Prewitt IRD4 cut the article out with kitchen scissors and fixed it to her refrigerator with a cardinal-shaped magnet. She told her neighbor Martha she remembered the auction, remembered the man in the canvas jacket raising his hand, remembered the laugh, remembered Gerald folding the receipt and walking out without looking back. She said she always thought he knew something. June Maddox died 14 months after the signing on a Tuesday evening in October. The maple in the front yard had turned the color of fire. Gerald was beside her. He had been beside her all day, all year, all 46 years. Claire arrived from Scranton 20 minutes after the call. The house was quiet. The porch light was on. Gerald had turned it on that morning the way June had always turned it on for him, and he would turn it on every evening for the rest of his life, not because anyone was coming home, but because the light was a promise and promises do not expire when the person who made them is gone. That was what perpetual meant. Gerald understood perpetual better than anyone alive. He sat on the porch that night after Claire fell asleep. October air, wood smoke from Duff Kinney's stove. Fields dark. The corridor out there invisible, audible the low hum of machinery and security lights from the development that had broken ground 2 months earlier. Every truck crossing a 12-foot strip that generated $4,100 a month for the privilege. June's chair sat beside his. He did not move it. He would never move it. The chair had a crack in the left armrest that ran along the grain like a tributary on a map. Gerald had considered repairing it twice and decided against it both times because fixing it meant removing the chair from the porch, and Gerald was not willing to remove June's chair from its place beside his for any length of time, for any reason, because some things matter more for where they are than for what condition they are in, and June's chair belonged on this porch beside his chair, cracked armrest and peeling paint and all. Duff came by the week after the funeral. Cap in his hands, he did not say sorry. I was wrong about the stubborn part. Gerald nodded, poured 2 cups. They sat without speaking for 20 minutes, which was the longest Duff Kinney had ever been still in his life, and which was the most eloquent thing he had ever said. The first winter alone was the hardest. Not the cold, though the cold was genuine, the Western Pennsylvania variety that enters a house through every crack and seam and window frame and establishes itself in the walls and floors like a tenant who cannot be evicted until March. Not the loneliness, though. The loneliness was specific and unreachable, the kind that exists not in the absence of people, but in the absence of one particular person, the kind that casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil and left on the porch by churchwomen cannot address regardless of how much cream of mushroom soup they contain. The hardest part was the conversational silence, not the absence of sound. The house produced sound continuously. Furnace cycling, refrigerator humming, clock ticking, wind under the barn door, a thin whistle when it came from the northwest through the gap in the weather stripping Gerald had installed in 1994, and that had loosened over the decades and now admitted a blade of cold air that produced a note Gerald had been meaning to fix for 3 winters. The sounds of a house operating. They continued regardless of occupancy. The silence Gerald noticed was the absence of the sounds June made. The shuffle of her slippers on the hardwood at 6:30, the click of the burner under the kettle, the building hiss, the whistle at the boil, the 2 words she called every morning Gerald. Coffee. Spoken in a tone refined by 46 years into something that was neither command nor invitation, but both all warmth, no excess, the verbal equivalent of the porch light. The sound of her turning pages in the evening, the whisper of paper against paper in the living room. That sound, Gerald realized only after it was gone, had been a form of conversation. It said, I am here, I am content. That is enough. Gerald did not try to fill the silence. He lived with it the way a surveyor lives with terrain. Not by wishing it different, but by working with what is there. He made his own coffee. Same kettle, same burner, same method. June had told him once that letting the water sit 30 seconds after the boil made a better cup, and Gerald believed her because June knew the domestic world the way he knew the physical world thoroughly and without pretension. He cooked simply. Eggs in the morning, canned soup at lunch, frozen dinners that Claire stacked in the freezer on visits labeled in marker on masking tape, chicken beef stew lasagna. Small acts of care performed without comment and received without comment because neither Gerald nor Claire was the kind of person who required the narration of kindness in order for the kindness to count. Sundays he walked to the cemetery, 1.5 miles east. June was buried on the east slope facing the sunrise, Claire's choice because she said her mother was a morning person. Gerald stood for 10 minutes, said nothing, walked home. His connection to June was not at the cemetery. It was in the house. In the table and the pillow and the glasses on the nightstand and the housecoat on the hook behind the bedroom door and the crossword 3/4 finished with the pencil beside it. The crossword sat on the table for 6 months. Gerald did not finish it. He could have. He knew most of the answers. But finishing June's crossword would have meant it was done, and done meant completed, and completed meant the last thing her hand touched in this kitchen was over, and Gerald was not ready for that. Claire moved it in April, placed it in the personal folder in the filing cabinet beside the furnace next to the bank rejection letter, And June's note and the other artifacts of a private history that appeared in no public record, but that mattered as much as the 1912 plat, because they were the evidence of what the patients cost and who paid and who believed and who was right. Claire spent a weekend with the filing cabinet that month. She found everything: tax receipts in chronological order, the Greenway letter, Gerald's 6-word reply, LLC tracking, the 2018 photographs, and in the bottom drawer folder labeled personal, 2 things she had not expected: the loan rejection from 1991, which Gerald told June he had thrown away. Risk profile is unfavorable. He had kept it for 28 years. Filed it. Because Gerald Maddox did not discard evidence of his own history, even the parts that stung. And June's note: measure twice and come home safe. The paper was soft as cloth. The ink had faded to almost nothing. Claire held it to the window the way she held the 1912 plat, the way Gerald held it in the library, the way Judge Whitfield held it in the hearing room. The light passed through and the words appeared faint, legible, written by a young woman in 1975 who loved a quiet man and who understood that the most important thing she could say to him was, not "I love you, but come home safe," because measuring twice was who he was. Coming home was the part that needed saying. She put the note back, closed the drawer, went upstairs, sat across from Gerald at the kitchen table. She was right, Claire said, about all of it. Gerald looked at the empty chair, the pillow, the glasses, the crossword that was no longer there but whose absence was its own kind of presence. She was right about everything he said. Mrs. Ewell retired from the library in 2020. On her last day, she found a note on the circulation desk in mechanical pencil on plain paper. Thank you for the chair. No signature. She knew. She pinned it to the break room bulletin board where it remained 3 years before being moved to the archive room beside Plat Book 19 in its new protective sleeve, because the county clerk had finally understood that page 114 was the most expensive piece of paper in the county's entire collection. The monthly payments continued, $4,100 on the first, adjusted each January. Gerald used the money for Bill's groceries, house maintenance, and a contribution to Claire's retirement fund that June had insisted on before she died, set up with a young advisor named Patterson, who explained IRAs with the earnest patience of a man unaccustomed to sitting across from someone who already understood the explanation, but who listened anyway because Gerald was polite and listening cost nothing. Gerald did not think of the money as money. He thought of it as measurement, a monthly confirmation that the clause was valid, the strip was his, the 23 years had counted. The patients converted through legal mechanism into a number that appeared each month and would continue to appear, adjusted, transferable for a 40-year term, expiring in 2059, by which time the clause would be 147 years old and still perpetual and still sitting on page 114 in its protective sleeve, waiting for the next person who bothered to read it. He continued walking the strip every April, not because the easement required it, because he had been walking it for 23 years and the habit was no longer separable from the man. He cleared saplings, checked stakes, opened the notebook, wrote the date. He replaced the weather stripping on the barn door in January 2021. The gap was 3/16 of an inch larger than his ear, had estimated a discrepancy between auditory assessment and physical measurement that Gerald noted with mild professional irritation. He fixed the downspout on the east wall that same fall, 3 years after the rivets began loosening, climbing a ladder he should not have been climbing at 75, but climbing anyway, because calling someone to fix a downspout was an admission of incapacity he was not prepared to make. He replaced the porch boards one at a time across 4 weekends, 6 boards per trip to the lumberyard because 6 was all that fit, without overhanging the tailgate, and Gerald would not drive with an unsecured load. The house was his instrument now, his last survey. He maintained it with the same care he had given every tool he had ever used, because a man who lets his tools deteriorate is a man who has stopped caring about his work, and Gerald Maddox had not stopped caring about his work and was not going to start. Claire called every Wednesday at 7, 10 minutes, never more than 15. Gerald's phone manner did not accommodate the silences he used in person, the pauses that gave his words their weight, and over the phone the pauses sounded like dead air, prompting Claire to ask if he was still there, interrupting the pause, defeating its purpose. So the calls were efficient. How are you? Fine. The house? Fine. Duff. Duff is Duff, Saturday. Good. Both felt better afterward. The value was not the content, it was the recurrence. Duff came every other Saturday. No agenda. He sat on the porch, drank coffee, said nothing or said something about feed corn or road conditions. Gerald nodded or did not nod. Sometimes 20 minutes passed without a word. Duff always left feeling something had been communicated. Gerald always felt something had been received. Neither could have named what it was. That was the nature of 30-year friendships between men who have passed beyond the need for language into the territory where presence is enough. In April of 2021, Claire walked the strip with him for the first time. She had driven from Scranton the night before, slept in the back bedroom, woken to the sound of Gerald making coffee the way June made it. She put on hiking boots she had bought for a trip she never took, and followed her father past the barn, through the fence break, and onto the 12-foot strip that had been the axis of their family's life for 25 years. Gerald showed her how to use the brush hook, the swing, the angle, the wrist turn at the moment of contact that directs the cut rather than simply powering through it. His father's technique, his father's blade, his father's handle. She took the brush hook in both hands, left near the base, right near the blade. She swung. A sapling the diameter of her thumb fell sideways with a sound like a quick exhale, green at the cut, the sap already darkening in the April air. Gerald nodded. Good. One word. But Claire heard everything in it: approval, pride, the quiet transmission of responsibility from one generation to the next, the passing of the brush hook in the notebook, in the strip, in the claws, and the patience from a man who spent 23 years learning to wait to a woman who spent her life learning to be ready. They cleared the strip from both ends and met in the middle where it crossed the access road. Gerald opened the notebook. Maintenance performed. G Maddox and C Maddox. Strip in good condition, stakes intact, drainage clear. 25th year. Two names where there had always been one. That was the year Claire opened her own practice in Scranton, property title disputes. She hung a framed copy of page 114 of Plat Book 19 on the wall behind her desk. She kept a green notebook in her drawer. Same brand as Gerald's, same size. Bought from Horvath's store on Elm Street, now run by the original Horvath's son, who remembered Gerald and had read about the settlement, and who charged Claire full price because nostalgia is not a discount. She told every new client the same thing her father had shown her, by example across 23 years of April's document everything. Write it down, date it, keep it. The paperwork is not the work. The paperwork is proof the work was done, and proof is the only thing that survives a courtroom. In the spring of 2022, Gerald turned 76. Claire brought a chocolate cake from a bakery in town and a new brush hook with a hickory handle darker and heavier than the old ash. Gerald held it, tested the weight, examined the blade, bright, sharp, unused, set it against the wall by the door next to his father's brush hook, which he did not throw away because Gerald Maddox did not discard things that had earned their place. The old brush hook would stand against that wall until Gerald no longer lived in this house. And when Claire cleaned out the house after Gerald was gone, she would find it there and know what it was and keep it, because she had learned from her father that some things are worth keeping, not for what they can do, but for what they have done. Thank you, Gerald said. Two words carrying the weight of everything he did not say, the way a receipt for $79.90 carries the weight of a 23-year story. They sat on the porch, Claire in June's chair, the cracked armrest, the peeling paint. Gerald watched his daughter settle into his wife's chair and felt the combination of grief and continuity that exists only in a life where the people you love have occupied the same spaces across different decades, where a chair held one woman for 30 years and now holds another, and both are the right person in the right chair at the right time. The Mercer Quarter project opened in phases. Retail first 2021, residential 2022, the public plaza with the fountain in the fall of 2022, a ribbon cutting attended by commissioners and a state senator who spoke about investment, vision, and community transformation. Not one word about a 12-foot strip or a green notebook or a receipt or a man in a canvas jacket. Gerald did not attend. He did not need to see the surface. He had always known what was underneath. In the summer of 2023, he drove past the development for the first time. Not intentionally. A detour on Route 9. Through the truck window, he saw glass buildings and landscape plazas and the access road curving in from the highway, the road that crossed his strip, the road that generated $4,100 a month. People on sidewalks that had not existed 3 years earlier. Cars in parking lots that had been empty fields. He did not feel pride or vindication. He felt the recognition that comes when a man who has carried something heavy for a long time finally sets it down and discovers that the carrying has changed him, that the muscles he built to hold the weight are now permanent, that the weight is gone, but the strength remains. He drove home. He did not mention the drive to anyone. That fall, Claire called from her office. A woman named Sandra Trent, property owner in a county south of Mercer, had a gas pipeline company claiming easement rights over her farmland based on a 1954 filing. Sandra had found through her own library research a prior 1931 filing that the pipeline's title search had missed because the search started in 1945 and did not go back far enough. She had heard about Gerald Maddox. Everyone in western Pennsylvania who cared about land rights had heard about Gerald Maddox. The story had traveled the way good stories travel in rural counties, acquiring embellishments and losing details, but gaining the irreducible core that cannot be disputed once it has been told. Enough times a man bought swamp for almost nothing, found a clause, waited 20 years and won. Claire took the case, drove to the county, spent 2 days in the library reading plat books the way her father had spent 2 years in the Mercer County Library, found the 1931 filing, verified no dissolution, prepared a response citing among other precedents the Maddox easement ruling. The pipeline company settled. Sandra kept her land. Claire called Gerald that evening. "Dad, I used your case." Gerald was on the porch. Coffee, evening light, June's chair. "How did it go?" "She won." 3 seconds of silence. Gerald's 3-second silence was the equivalent of another man's standing ovation. "Good. Dad, you started something." Gerald drank his coffee, looked at the fields. "I did not start anything. I read what was there. Other people will read what is there. The clauses are in the books. The books are in the libraries. The libraries are open." That was his final word on the subject. He did not consider himself a pioneer or a strategist. He was a man who read the ground. The ground told him the line was here. He stood on it. Standing on it turned out to be worth $4,100 a month, which was a number he had not predicted and did not care about, except as confirmation that the measurement was correct. The measurement was always the point. Claire visited every other Saturday, 2 hours from Scranton in the blue Honda, which now had 140,000 miles and a second dent in the front bumper from a parking garage downtown. She pulled into the driveway. The gravel announced her. Gerald was on the porch. He did not get up because getting up was not required. What was required was being there present, available in the chair where she expected him. She sat in June's chair. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them was the same silence that had existed between Gerald and June for 46 years, the silence that is not emptiness, but architecture, not absence, but form. After a while, Claire told him about her cases. A farmer in Sullivan County whose well water rights were challenged by a fracking company. A widow in Pike County whose driveway easement was blocked by a new neighbor's fence. A family in Susquehanna County whose hunting cabin was annexed through a rezoning nobody notified them about. Small cases, important cases, cases that mattered to the people inside them, the way Gerald's case mattered to Gerald, not because of the money, but because of the principle, which was the same principle in every case. The ground is what it is, the right granted upon it is what it was granted, and neither changes, because someone with more money and more attorneys decides it should. Gerald listened. He asked 1 or 2 questions, always about the documentation. Did the client keep records, pay taxes, maintain the property? He did not ask about legal strategy because he trusted Claire's strategy. He asked about evidence, because evidence is the only thing that survives a courtroom. Everything else is argument, and argument is weather, and weather passes. Evidence is ground. Ground stays. Some Saturdays they walked the strip. Not every Saturday. In April, always. Sometimes October, when the air was cool and the light golden, and the brush had grown tall enough since spring to make the walk interesting. Gerald with the brush hook, Claire with the notebook. They worked from both ends and met in the middle, and Gerald noted that Claire's swing improved each year. The wrist turned more natural, the angle more precise. the sound of the blade closer to the sound his father's blade made on the Crawford County farm 50 years ago. After the walk, they sat on the porch. Gerald made coffee. Claire drank it even though she preferred tea because the coffee was made the way June made it, and drinking it was a form of honoring a woman who said 30 seconds after the boil, and who was right about that the way she was right about everything. Gerald developed a habit in the evenings of his 77th year that he could not explain. After dinner, after coffee, after the porch and the light and the crickets, he went to the living room and took the green notebook from the shelf and opened it to a random page and read one entry. Just one. He did not start at the beginning. He opened wherever the pages fell, trusting the book to give him what he needed. April 2003, 7th maintenance. Cleared saplings northeast section. Brush heavier than previous year. Stakes in good condition. Noted fox den at southwest boundary. April 2011, 15th maintenance. Stakes in good condition. Northeast stakes showing slight lateral displacement, possible frost heave. Reset with mallet. June not well. Paid tax invoice from hospital parking lot. April 2018, 22nd maintenance. Heavy overgrowth. 2 hours to clear. New tire tracks visible on northeast access. Not mine. Photographed. Each entry was a window compressed into 4 lines. He could read 2011 and feel June's illness behind the neutral words. He could read 2018 and feel the tension of the tire tracks. He could read 2003 and remember the fox den, a small excavation at the base of a dead oak surrounded by scattered feathers and bones, evidence of a resident that chose Gerald's strip as territory because the strip was quiet and maintained and had the quality of being left alone that attracts creatures who prefer to live without disturbance. The fox was gone now. Gerald noted its den in 3 consecutive entries and then stopped because the den was empty, the entrance collapsed, the oak fallen. The fox moved on, or died, or both, because everything does everything except the claws in the land and the notebook entries that recorded a man's presence across 23 seasons. He closed the notebook each evening and returned it to the shelf and went to bed. The reading was his evening ritual, though he would not have used that word. He was a man who read the ground and trusted what it told him, and if that constituted faith, then the faith was in the measurement rather than the divine, and the measurement had never let him down. He thought about time differently now. At 48, time was an opponent. At 50, a medium. At 60, a companion. At 70, a partner that deserved acknowledgement. At 77, time was the ground itself. The thing that everything is built upon. The thing that does not change because you want it to, does not hurry because you need it to, does not stop because you wish it would. Time was the ground. The ground was what Gerald knew. And knowing the ground was the only thing that had ever been required of him. June knew this before he did. She knew it when she placed the library card beside his coffee. She knew it when she said, "You are best when you are searching." She knew it when she refused to let him sell. She knew it when she held his hand in the dark and said, "Find another way." She knew that Gerald's relationship with time was his relationship with the ground, and both required the same thing: patience. The willingness to let the process unfold at its own speed. The willingness to accept that 1 inch is enough. Gerald thought about June every day. Not with the sharp grief of the first year, with something deeper, something integrated into the texture of his days, the way the grain of the ash handle was darkened by decades of hand oil. He thought about her when he made coffee, when he turned on the porch light, when he opened the notebook, when he walked the strip in April and heard the brush hook cut through a sapling, when Claire sat in her chair on the porch and they watched the fields in silence and the evening was warm and the crickets sang the way they had always sung, indifferent to grief, indifferent to money, indifferent to the clauses and hearings and settlements that humans conducted on the surface while the insects continued their ancient, repetitive, perfect work beneath it. He did not miss her in the way that the word is usually understood as longing for return. Gerald understood that return was not possible, and that longing for the impossible was a waste of the energy that should be spent on the things that were still possible. Coffee, porch, sitting, strip, walking, notebook, reading, porch light, turning on gut or cleaning, daughter visiting, silence, maintaining life, living. Because life continues, that is what life does. And the man who stops living because the person he loved has stopped, has failed to understand the most basic lesson of the ground, which is that the ground continues regardless always, and the things planted in it continue, and the rights granted upon it continue, and the word perpetual means what it means. And what it means is not just the clause. What it means is everything. There is a particular kind of man who exists in every county in America, though he is rarely celebrated and never seeks to be. The watchmaker who can hear a broken mainspring in a ticking case. The carpenter who feels the grain direction through his palm before the saw touches wood. The farmer who reads the dawn sky and knows within half an hour when the rain will start. These men do not advertise what they know. They do not lecture or seek students. They do what they do, and the doing is so precise and so consistent that it passes beneath notice the way the rotation of the earth passes beneath notice, always occurring, never acknowledged, fundamental to everything. Gerald Maddox was this kind of man. He knew land, not the way developers know it as commodity, not the way attorneys know it as legal construct, not the way farmers know it as growing medium. Gerald knew land the way land knows itself, as fact, as a thing that remains when everything built upon it has been removed. Buildings come down, roads wear out, maps are drawn and redrawn again. But the ground stays exactly where it has always been, and the line through it stays exactly where it was drawn, and the right granted upon it stays exactly as valid as the day it was recorded, unless someone files to dissolve it, and nobody filed. And Gerald knew nobody filed because Gerald checked, because checking was not a professional obligation but a moral one. And morality for Gerald was identical to precision, and precision was identical to respect, and respect was what the ground deserved from anyone who claimed to understand it. The green notebook sat on the shelf between June's wedding photograph and the framed receipt. 27 years of entries now, 27 Aprils documented in mechanical pencil. Gerald had walked the strip that morning, the 27th time hickory brush hook in hand, the tool developing its own patina. Now 2 years of use building the dark sheen of palm oil into the grain, slowly the way character builds in the objects a man touches regularly enough and long enough. The old brush hook stood against the wall by the door, ash handle cracked along the grain, retired but not discarded, honored by proximity. He opened the notebook, wrote the date. The pen moved with the unhesitating fluency of a hand that has been making these entries for 27 years and does not need to consider what to write because the format has never changed and will never change because there is no reason to change something that works. Maintenance performed. G. Maddox, strip in good condition, stakes intact, drainage clear, 27th year. He closed the notebook and stood on the strip and looked northeast toward the river and southwest toward Route 9, and thought about T.R. Fenton writing 7 lines in 1912 in an office that smelled like pipe tobacco and ing, and about his father with the post hole digger in January, and about June with the library card beside his coffee, and about Claire with the plat held to the window, and about Russell Flagg turning in his chair, and about Edna Pruitt with the cardinal magnet, and about Mrs. Ewell pulling the next volume from the archive, and about Duff with his cap in his hands, and about the porch light that had been on since 1972 and would be on tonight and tomorrow night and every night. He walked home. The gravel announced him. In the quiet hours of the house, Gerald maintained the domestic systems that June had managed for 4 decades and that he had taken over with the same methodical attention he gave to every responsibility. He changed the furnace filter every 3 months, caulked the windows every fall, cleaned the gutters twice a year, spring and autumn, climbing the ladder he should not have been climbing, wearing the canvas jacket carrying the same precision, up the rungs that he carried along every boundary line he had ever walked. He washed his own laundry on Tuesdays, a schedule June had established, and that Gerald continued, because he saw no reason to change it using the same detergent. June had used the same temperature settings, the same folding method she had demonstrated once in 1976 when they were first married, and that Gerald had learned and repeated without deviation for 47 years. Because once you learn the right way to do something, there is no justification for doing it any other way. And June's way was the right way, and Gerald had accepted this early and comprehensively, and without the masculine protest that some men bring to domestic tasks, because Gerald did not rank tasks by gender. He ranked them by importance, and clean laundry was important, and the method that produced clean laundry correctly was June's method, and that was the end of the analysis. He kept the house in a state that June would have found acceptable, which was a standard higher than merely clean and lower than immaculate, somewhere in the range of maintained, which was the same word Gerald would have used to describe the strip and which carried for Gerald the same weight of obligation. A maintained property is a respected property. A respected property is a known property. A known property is a defended property. These connections were not metaphorical for Gerald. They were structural. The same logic that compelled him to clear brush and check stakes and record observations in the notebook compelled him to sweep the kitchen floor and wipe the counter and wash the windows and keep the porch board sound and the gutter clean and the weather stripping tight and the downspout attached and the furnace filter fresh and the lock oiled and the clock wound and the light on. Every act of maintenance was an assertion of presence. Every assertion of presence was a defense of ownership. Every defense of ownership was a form of patience because patience is not the absence of action. Patience is the sustained performance of the right action at the right time over and over without variation, without recognition, without reward, until the accumulated weight of all those performances becomes irrefutable evidence of something that no amount of money or legal argument can overcome. This is mine. I have tended it. I have recorded my tending, and you cannot take it from me because I have never stopped showing up. The seasons turned. Gerald moved through them the way he moved through everything at his own pace, the pace that had been constant since the fence line in Crawford County when he was 12, and that had carried him through every temperature and every terrain and every crisis and every duo his life had contained. Spring brought the strip and the notebook and the brush hook. Summer brought the porch and the coffee and the evening light and the crickets. Fall brought the cemetery walk and the gutters and the caulking and the slow golden decline of the fields toward winter. Winter brought the furnace and the silence and the weather stripping and the particular quality of cold morning light through the kitchen window that made the scarred oak table look like it was made of amber. Each season produced its own sounds. Spring the brush hook through saplings, the birds returning the creek running high with snowmelt. Summer the machines in the corridor, the crickets at dusk, the gravel under Claire's tires every other Saturday. Fall the wind through bare branches, the furnace kicking on the crunch of frozen leaves under Gerald's boots on Sunday morning walks to the cemetery. Winter the whistle under the barn door, the snap of cold contracted wood in the house frame, the sound of the plow on Route 9 at 4 in the morning. A sound so familiar it no longer woke Gerald, but that entered his sleep and became part of whatever he was dreaming, which was usually nothing because Gerald's sleeping mind was as practical as his waking mind and did not waste its time on images that did not correspond to reality. He was 77 years old. He had been a surveyor for 19 years and a property owner for 27 years, and a husband for 46 years, and a father for 41 years, and a widower for 3 years, and a patient man for 40 years, ever since the afternoon at the fence line when his father showed him the rock and the digger and the way water works around a stone. He had lived the life that was available to him, not the life he might have imagined for himself at 25 or 30 or 40, because imagination is not the same thing as preparation, and preparation was the only activity Gerald trusted. He had not imagined buying swamp at a tax auction. He had not imagined finding a clause written by a dead clerk. He had not imagined waiting 23 years for a moment that would last 9 minutes in a hearing room. He had not imagined $4,100 a month. He had not imagined June dying before he finished showing her that the patience she had believed in was justified. He had not imagined any of it. He had prepared for it. Preparation was different from imagination. Imagination builds the house you want to live in. Preparation builds the house you can defend. Gerald had built a defensible house. Not the house on Sycamore Road, though. That house was defensible, too. Its porch boards sound, its gutters clean, its weather stripping tight. The house Gerald built was made of notebook entries and tax receipts and maintenance logs and photographs and a steady, unbroken 23-year record of a man showing up to tend land that nobody else believed was worth tending. That house could not be foreclosed. That house could not be condemned. That house was built on ground that Gerald Maddox had measured and maintained and documented with a precision that no developer, no attorney, no banker, no county commissioner, and no laughing man in a sport coat could challenge because the evidence was complete, the record was unbroken. And the word on page 114 was perpetual. The receipt was on the wall, framed by Claire. Morning light hit it at 10:15 each day, a rectangle of sunlight that moved across the glass and illuminated the faded numbers. $79.90. The most profitable purchase in the history of Mercer County, made by a man who had been told his risk profile was unfavorable, in a room where a banker laughed on a Saturday morning in July 27 years ago. Gerald passed the receipt every morning on his way to the stove. He did not stop to look at it. He did not need to. He knew what it said. He knew what it meant. He knew what it had cost: 19 years of career, reduced to a cardboard box, 2 years in a library, 23 years of brush clearing, in tax payments, in notebook entries, in silence, in refusal and steadiness, a second mortgage, in the terror of losing the house, June's illness, in June's faith, in June's death, in the silence after the silence that was not absence but architecture, the silence that held everything the words could not. Some mornings walking past the receipt, Gerald allowed himself to think about Russell Flagg. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the clinical interest of a man examining a phenomenon. Russell Flagg was a man who evaluated risk from the surface. He looked at Gerald's shoes and Gerald's address and Gerald's bank balance, and he calculated the probability of default, and he determined that the probability was too high, and he wrote the word unfavorable, and he moved on to the next application. Russell Flagg was not wrong exactly. He was incomplete. He measured what was visible and ignored what was buried. And the thing about buried things is that they stay buried until they don't. And when they surface with the accumulated force of everything that has been pressing down on them for decades. And the man who dismissed them has no defense except the surprised silence of a Sunday morning in a leather chair with a newspaper article in his lap, and the dawning understanding that unfavorable was not a description of Gerald Maddox. It was a description of Russell Flagg's ability to see what was in front of him. Gerald did not gloat. Gloating was for men who needed other people to know they had won. Gerald did not need anyone to know anything. The knowledge was in the notebook. The knowledge was on the shelf. The knowledge was in the strip 12 feet wide, half a mile long, cleared every April, maintained every year, documented every season, perpetual. He poured his coffee. He sat at the table. He looked through the kitchen window at the same view he had looked at every morning for 30 years. Fields, trees, sky barn, the faint distant sounds of a development he had never visited and never intended to visit, the sounds of money moving across his land, the sounds of machinery and commerce, and the daily operation of a $36 million project that could not function without crossing 12 feet of earth that Gerald Maddox bought for the price of dinner. The view had not changed. The fields were the same fields. The trees were the same trees, older and taller and thicker, but fundamentally the same, rooted in the same soil, growing at the same rate, indifferent to the passage of decades and the events that occurred beneath their canopy. The sky was the sky, sometimes the color of dishwater, sometimes the color of copper and rose. Always the same sky. Gerald was not a man who drew lessons from his own experience. He was a man who lived his experience and let other people draw lessons from it if they wanted to, which some did and some did not, and Gerald did not care which. But if someone had asked him, if someone had sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked what he had learned in 27 years of owning a piece of land that the world considered worthless, and that turned out to be the most valuable parcel in the county, Gerald would have said something simple. He would have said it in the flat, unhurried voice he used for all statements of fact, the voice that did not argue and did not persuade, and did not ask to be believed because it did not need to be believed. It needed only to be accurate. He would have said, check the old maps. That was all. 3 words. The distillation of 27 years and 19 years of surveying before that, and 12 years of watching his father work before that, the entire accumulated wisdom of Gerald Maddox's life compressed into a sentence that any first-year law student could understand, and that no one at the Mercer County Planning Commission or the Development Authority or Harlow's title firm had bothered to act on. Check the old maps, because the new ones cover the old ones, because assumptions cover facts, because the surface covers the ground, and the ground is where the truth lives. The ground is where the clause lives. The ground is where the line lives, and the line does not move because someone with a $36 million project would prefer it to. The line is here. It has always been here, and it always will be. On warm evenings, Gerald sat on the porch with his coffee and listened to the world. The corridor humming, the crickets singing, the wind through the trees. June's chair beside his empty and full empty of the woman and full of the years the woman spent in it, and Gerald beside it, the way he had been beside everything in his life, steadily at the speed of the ground, unhurried, unsurprised, certain. The green notebook on the shelf, 27 Aprils, 27 tax receipts, 27 acts of faith in a piece of earth the world dismissed and one man did not. The receipt on the wall, $79.90, the beginning. The clause on page 114, 7 lines, the foundation. The porch light on, the promise, perpetual. Claire in June's chair every other Saturday. The continuation. Some evenings when the light hit the fields just right and the wind carried the sounds of the corridor and the crickets began their ancient chorus and the darkness gathered at the edges of the porch like something patient, Gerald could almost hear her voice, clear and steady and certain. The voice of a woman who knew him better than he knew himself and who was stubborn enough to say the things he needed to hear at the exact moments he needed to hear them, and who had been right about everything, everything from the first day to the last. How long are you going to wait? He had waited long enough. The porch light was on. The chair was occupied. The strip was clear. The notebook was full. The receipt was framed. The clause was valid. The payment arrived on the 1st. The land was his. The line was here. The fence was finished. The ground had given what the ground would give. And the man who kept striking had found the gap. $4,100 a month for the rest of his life. And after, because that was what perpetual meant. After Gerald, after Claire, after the development and the investors and the attorneys and the judges and the clerks, after the buildings aged and the fountain needed repair and the retail spaces changed tenants and the residential units turned over, and nobody remembered who built the project or who stopped it or who sat in a hearing room on a June morning and watched a judge hold a piece of linen paper to a window and read 7 lines of ink that had been waiting 84 years. Perpetual meant after all of it, after memory, after the story had been told so many times the numbers rounded and the names blurred, and what remained was not the fact, but the shape of the fact smoothed the way rivers smooth stones, wearing away the detail, leaving the form. An old man bought swamp for almost nothing. He held it for decades. He said no to every offer. His wife believed in him. His daughter fought for him. And the swamp was worth more than anyone who laughed at it ever imagined. That was the shape. The details were in the notebook on the shelf, in the filing cabinet beside the furnace, in folders labeled by year. Proof that he had been here. Proof that he had paid. Proof that he had cleared and checked and recorded 23 times 23 Aprils, 23 acts of faith in a piece of earth that the world looked at and saw nothing, and that Gerald Maddox looked at and saw everything. The details would outlast the shape. They would sit in the notebook in the cabinet long after the last person who remembered Gerald's face had forgotten it. Whoever came next, whoever opened the drawer, whoever turned to the first page and read the first entry. April 1997. First maintenance cleared brush set stake, strip in good condition. Whoever found that page would understand something simpler than strategy and older than law. They would understand that a man showed up, that he kept showing up, that he did not stop when the world told him to, or when the money ran out, or when his wife got sick, or when the offers came, or when the stakes were pulled, or when the debris was dumped, or when the laughter echoed off cinder block walls in a courthouse basement. He showed up, he measured, he recorded, he waited. And the land remembered, and the clause was perpetual, and the porch light was on. And Gerald Maddox, 77 years old, retired county surveyor, owner of 1.7 acres of what the world once called swamp brush, in a drainage ditch, sat in his chair with his coffee and his silence and his patience and his notebook and his receipt and his memory of a woman who gave him a library card and told him to go read something, and who was right about everything from the first day to the last, and he was content. Not happy, content. There is a difference. Happiness is weather. It comes and goes. Content is ground. It sets, stays, it holds. It bears the weight of everything placed upon it, the grief and the joy and the silence, and the years, all the years, stacked one on top of another like maps in a county archive, each covering the one beneath each, adding its marks, and underneath all of them at the bottom, on page 114 of Platt Book, 19 lines of ink on linen paper, written by a man named T.R. Fenton on the 3rd of April, 1912, in a hand that was taught by 1 century and carried its lessons into the next, and was read by a man named Gerald Maddox in the century after that. And the word had not changed in 115 years, and it would not change in 115 more. Perpetual. The porch light glowed, the fields were dark, the corridor hummed, the crickets sang, the chair was beside his. The notebook was closed, the receipt was on the wall. The ground held everything. And Gerald Maddox was home. But the land had stories it told only to the man who walked it every April, stories written not in ink but in the physical evidence of seasons passing over a 12-foot corridor that had been at various points in its 115-year recorded history. A wagon path, a drainage easement, a rail corridor, access point, a forgotten strip on a forgotten map in a forgotten plat book, a piece of delinquent tax property assessed at $47 per acre, a joke told by a banker in a basement, a lifeline held by a surveyor who had lost his career, a source of bitter argument between a man and his neighbor, a legal battleground where $36 million collided with $79.90, and finally, permanently, the thing it had been since 1912, a perpetual right-of-way owned by whoever held the underlying parcel and maintained by whoever had the patience to show up every spring and cut the brush and check the stakes and write the date. The strip had its own ecology, not the kind that appears in textbooks, the kind that develops when a narrow corridor of land is maintained in a state of arrested succession, cleared annually, never plowed, never paved, never built upon, simply cut back to the ground once a year and allowed to grow until the next cutting. The saplings were mostly box elder and black cherry opportunistic species that colonize disturbed ground within a season and can grow 6 feet in a single summer if the conditions are right, and the conditions on Gerald's strip were usually right because the drainage was adequate and the soil, despite what the tax assessor's office believed, was better than the word swamp suggested. Gerald had known this from the first walk. The soil was loam over clay, dark rich, the kind that holds moisture without drowning roots. The kind that a farmer would recognize immediately as productive ground, mislabeled by a bureaucrat who had never put a shovel in it and who had assessed it from an office based on the presence of seasonal standing water, which was a drainage issue, not a soil quality issue, and which Gerald had corrected in 1999 by cutting a shallow channel at the northeast end that directed the standing water toward the creek, a modification that took 3 hours of work with a spade, and that transformed the strip from seasonally wet to consistently dry, a transformation that cost Gerald nothing except labor, and that the county assessor's office never acknowledged because the county assessor's office had never visited the parcel and had no reason to visit it and would not have known what to look for if they had. The annual cycle of growth and cutting produced a particular landscape. In early spring, before Gerald's April visit, the strip was a tangle of last year's dead growth and this year's new shoots, the brown and the green interlocking in the chaotic abundance of a system that has been released from the order imposed on it the previous April and is in the process of reverting to its default state, which is chaos, because the default state of all land is chaos. In order is something that must be imposed and maintained and reimposed every year by the hands of whoever has taken responsibility for imposing it. By late spring after Gerald's visit, the strip was clean, 12 feet wide, clear sight lines from one end to the other, the cut brush stacked at the edges, the stakes visible, the ground firm. By midsummer, the new growth was waist high. By late summer, it was head high. By fall, the box elders had thickened to the diameter of a pencil, and the black cherries had put out lateral branches, and the strip looked to anyone who did not know its history like an unremarkable stretch of young forest growing in the margins of a developed corridor. Only Gerald knew that this apparent wildness was temporary, that it would be cut back in April, that the cycle would begin again, that the land was not wild but managed by a man with a brush hook, who appeared once a year and imposed order on chaos and then disappeared for 11 months and allowed the chaos to return because the chaos was part of the system, because growth and cutting was the rhythm of the strip, the rhythm that Gerald had established in 1997 and maintained for 27 years, and that Claire would maintain after him. The strip had taught Gerald things about land that he had not learned in 19 years of government surveying. Government surveying was about measurement. It was about establishing the position of a line to a tolerance of a 16th of an inch over a distance of a quarter mile. It was about precision. It was not about relationship. Gerald's relationship with the strip was different from his professional relationship with the properties he had surveyed. He had measured those properties. He had walked them. He had established their boundaries and testified to their dimensions, but he had not tended them. He had not returned to them year after year to cut and clear and check and record. He had not watched them change through 27 cycles of seasons. He had not noticed the way the drainage patterns shifted when he cut the channel in 1999, the way the soil darkened as the annual cutting and decomposition of brush added organic matter, the way the fox chose the strip as its territory in 2001 and abandoned it in 2004, the way the bird population changed when the black cherries matured enough to produce fruit, the way the ground smelled different in April than in October, way the morning light fell differently on the cleared strip than on the surrounding growth, the way the strip existed as a defined space within the landscape, a corridor of managed land within a larger corridor of development, a human imposition on the natural order that required annual renewal, annual commitment, annual presence. The strip taught him that land is not a thing you own. It is a relationship you maintain. Ownership is a legal concept. Maintenance is a physical act. The legal concept gives you the right. The physical act gives you the knowledge. And the knowledge is what matters because the knowledge is what you bring to the hearing room. The knowledge of 23 years of April entries written in mechanical pencil. The knowledge that the Northeast stake was displaced by frost heave in 2011 and reset with a mallet. The knowledge that someone dumped debris in 2018. The knowledge that the drainage improved after the channel was cut. The knowledge that the soil was loam over clay and not swamp. The knowledge that the 12-foot strip was not a worthless piece of forgotten land, but a perpetual right-of-way that had been alive for 84 years when Gerald found it, and that would be alive for 184 more, because perpetual does not have an expiration date because TR. Fenton chose his words carefully because words on linen paper written in proper ink by a man with the legal authority to notarize them do not decay, do not fade into irrelevance, do not lose their force because a century has passed and the world has built a $36 million project on top of them. The words hold, the way the ground holds, the way the line holds, the way patience holds. Gerald understood all of this. He had understood it since the Tuesday in the library when he turned to page 114. He had understood it through 23 years of waiting and 3 years of widowhood and the slow, steady, unremarkable passage of seasons that constituted the remainder of his life. He did not need the understanding to be acknowledged. He did not need it to be published or taught or discussed at conferences. He needed it to be true, and it was true. He had verified it with 27 years of measurements, and the measurements were correct, and the line was here, and the line was his. In the mornings, Gerald stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the light arrive. It came over the hills east of Route 9 first, as a gray suggestion, then as a golden line along the ridgetops, then as a full flood that poured down the slopes and across the fields, and through the kitchen window, and onto the oak table where the map still lived under the sugar bowl. The ballpoint pen line from Route 9 to the river, still sharp after 27 years, because ballpoint ink does not fade the way pencil does, and because Gerald had drawn it with the pressure of a man who intended it to last. The light moved across the table surface and reached the wall where the receipt hung. $79.90. The glass caught the light and the numbers appeared through the glare with the clarity of something important made visible by the right angle of illumination, the way the 1912 clause appeared through the linen page when Judge Whitfield held it to the hearing room window. Everything important reveals itself in the right light. The skill is not in finding the right light. The skill is in having the patience to wait for it. Gerald finished his coffee. He rinsed the mug and set it upside down on the drain board. He checked the stove. He checked the lock. He walked to the front door and looked through the glass at the porch and the driveway and the road and the fields beyond. The porch light was still on from last night. It would stay on today and tonight and tomorrow and every day and every night for as long as Gerald lived in this house. And when he no longer lived in this house, it would stay on because Claire would keep it on because the porch light was not Gerald's to turn off. It was June's light. June turned it on in 1972, and it had been on ever since, and it would stay on because some promises are perpetual, the way some clauses are perpetual, the way some patience is perpetual, the way some love is perpetual. Not metaphorically, actually, perpetual the way the word means. Continuing without interruption, without expiration, without a clause that says except when, without a condition that says only if, without a limit that says until. Perpetual means perpetual. June understood this when she turned on the light. T.R. Fenton understood this when he wrote the clause. Gerald understood this when he raised his hand in the basement. Claire understood this when she held the plat to the window. They all understood the same thing, that the most powerful forces in the world and are not the dramatic ones, not the earthquakes or the floods or the $36 million projects with their architectural renderings and their ribbon-cutting ceremonies and their state senators giving speeches about vision. The most powerful forces are the quiet ones, the ones that continue, the ones that do not stop, the ones that show up every April with a brush hook and a notebook and the willingness to do again what was done last year and the year before and the year before that, because the doing is the point and the repetition is the proof and the proof is the power and the power is in the word. Perpetual. Gerald Maddox opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was cool. The fields were bright. Somewhere in the corridor, the machines were starting up for the day, the sounds of commerce beginning the daily traffic that would cross and recross again, the 12 feet of earth that had been the center of his life for 27 years, and that would be the center of his daughter's life after him and her children's life after her. Because the clause does not expire, the right does not dissolve, the land does not forget, and the man who reads the ground reads the truth, and the truth is perpetual. He sat down in his chair. June's chair sat beside him. The porch light glowed above them both. The coffee was done. The notebook was closed. The morning was beginning. The strip was quiet. The gravel was still. The field stretched east toward the corridor, where $36 million worth of glass and concrete and human ambitions sat upon the surface of the earth, visible and impressive and temporary, and beneath it all, invisible and unimpressive and permanent. 7 lines of ink on linen paper that said what they said and meant what they meant, and would continue to say it and mean it for as long as paper lasts and longer. Because even if the paper crumbles, the right remains, and even if the right is forgotten, the land remembers. And even if the land is built upon the ground beneath the building, holds everything that was ever written about it, and everything that was ever granted upon it, and everything that was ever measured across it, and everything that was ever defended in its name. The ground holds. It always holds. Gerald knew this. He had known it his whole life. He had known it while watching his father work a post-hole digger into frozen earth. He had known it as a young surveyor standing in a creek with mud to his shins and a steel tape in his hand. He had known it as a laid-off man sitting in a library reading linen-page books that nobody had opened in decades. He had known it as a husband holding his wife's hand at a kitchen table with a ballpoint pen line on a county map. He had known it as a father watching his daughter swing a brush hook for the first time and hearing the sound of the cut and saying good. He had known it in every moment of his 77 years, because knowing it was who he was the same way measuring was who he was, the same way patience was who he was, the same way the line was where the line was. Here, always here. And the porch light was on, and the coffee was strong, and the morning was good, and Gerald Maddox was home. There were things that Gerald kept that nobody knew about and that nobody would discover until Claire opened the filing cabinet for the last time whenever that time came. In the drawer labeled miscellaneous behind the tax maps and the zoning correspondence, there was a manila envelope that contained 6 items arranged in the order Gerald had placed them there over a span of 25 years. The first was the business card that Nolan Corrado had left on the porch railing in 2002, the cream-colored card with the embossed lettering that June had swept into the trash with the dead leaves 2 springs later, and that Gerald had retrieved from the trash can before the garbage truck came on Wednesday morning, because Gerald did not discard evidence, even evidence that arrived in the form of a business card from a man in a suit who offered $8,000 for a piece of land that would eventually generate $4,100 a month. The card was discolored now. Brown at the edges, the embossed letters flattened by time, but it was there. The second was the county's Greenway letter from 2007 The two-page request that mentioned community benefit 4 times and offered a dedication plaque and did not mention the 1912 clause because nobody at the Planning Commission knew the clause existed. Gerald's 6-word reply was stapled to the back, "I respectfully decline." 6 words that had taken him approximately 4 seconds to compose, and that he had considered briefly expanding into a longer explanation before deciding that 6 words was sufficient because the explanation was not the county's business, and brevity was, in Gerald's estimation, the purest form of clarity. The third was the single-page offer from Karen Lyle, $45,000. No cover letter, no explanation. Just a number on a page, as though a number were sufficient to describe the transaction, which it was not, because the transaction Karen Lyle was proposing was not the purchase of 1.7 acres of land. It was the purchase of a perpetual right-of-way that had been alive for 99 years and that the buyer did not know existed, which meant the buyer was offering $45,000 for something she did not understand, which meant the offer was not an offer at all. It was a guess, and Gerald did not deal in guesses. The fourth was a printout of the ALLC registrations that Claire had traced in 2012. Corridor Land Associates, Mercer Rail Holdings, Quarter Development LLC, all connected to Mercer Quarter investors. Russell Flagg's name highlighted in yellow marker, not by Gerald but by Claire, who had sent him the printout with the highlight already in place. A small act of editorial emphasis that conveyed without additional comment Claire's understanding of what the name meant and what it meant that the man who had laughed at Gerald in a courthouse basement was financially invested in the project that could not proceed without Gerald's permission. The fifth was the disposable camera from October 2018, still in its cardboard sleeve. The photographs already developed and filed separately in the folder labeled 2018, but the camera itself preserved because Gerald kept the container as well as the contents, the way he kept the envelope as well as the letter, the way he kept the mug as well as the note that had once been inside it, because the container was part of the story. Even if the container was empty, and stories that lose their containers lose their context. And context was everything Gerald had spent 23 years building. The sixth item was a newspaper clipping, not the article about the settlement which Claire had framed and which hung in her office in Scranton. A different article, a small item from the Mercer County Herald's real estate section, published in January 2023, months after the settlement was signed. The article reported that Mercer National Bank, Russell Flagg's former employer, had written down its investment in the Mercer Quarter project by an undisclosed amount following what the article described as unforeseen easement-related costs. The article was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned no names, it mentioned no amounts. It mentioned no 12-foot strip and no green notebook and no man in a canvas jacket. But Gerald had read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and had understood exactly what it meant, and he had cut it out with the kitchen scissors and placed it in the manila envelope behind the disposable camera. And he had not mentioned it to Claire or to Duff or to anyone because the article was not a trophy. It was a measurement, a confirmation. The final data point in a set that had been accumulating for 29 years since the day in 1991 when Russell Flagg wrote risk profile is unfavorable, and Gerald Maddox folded the letter and placed it in his wallet and walked out of the bank and into the rest of his life. The envelope sat in the drawer sat in the cabinet sat beside the furnace sat in the basement of the house on Sycamore Road, the house with the clapboard siding and the gravel driveway, and the barn with the vise and the brush hooks by the door, and the porch with the 2 chairs and the light that was always on. The house that Gerald Maddox had defended with the same patience he used to defend the Strip, and that he would continue to defend for as long as his body permitted him to climb the ladder and clean the gutters and replace the weather stripping and caulk the windows and change the furnace filter and sweep the kitchen floor and wipe the counter and wash the laundry on Tuesdays and make the coffee the way June made it and turn on the porch light every evening and walk to the cemetery on Sundays and walk the Strip in April and open the notebook and write the date. The date, always the date. The date was the most important part of every entry because the date was what established the continuity, the unbroken chain of annual maintenance that had defeated the adverse abandonment motion, and that would defeat any future motion that anyone might bring because the chain was now 27 links long and growing longer each April. and each link was dated, and each date was written in 2H mechanical pencil that did not fade, and the dates formed a sequence that was as irrefutable as a boundary measurement. Because a sequence is a kind of measurement, a measurement of persistence, a measurement of presence, a measurement of the distance between giving up and not giving up, which is the most important distance any man can measure, and which Gerald Maddox had been measuring for 27 years, and which the measurement showed to be infinite. Because Gerald Maddox had not given up and was not going to give up and did not understand giving up as a concept that applied to him or to the strip or to the clause or to the word perpetual, which meant exactly what it said. The notebook on the shelf, the receipt on the wall, the brush hooks by the door, the map under the sugar bowl, the coffee on the stove, the chair on the porch, the light above the door. These were the artifacts of Gerald Maddox's life. Not monuments, not trophies, artifacts, objects that derived their significance not from what they were, but from what they represented, which was time. Time spent, time invested, time converted through the mechanism of patience and documentation into a legal position so strong that a $36 million project could not move it, and a team of Philadelphia attorneys could not crack it, and a county judge needed only 9 minutes to confirm that it would stand. Time, that was what Gerald had invested, not money. $79.90 was not an investment. It was a statement, a declaration of intent. The investment was the 23 years that followed, the 23 Aprils, the 23 tax payments, the 23 notebook entries, the 3 refusals, the second mortgage, the photographs, the new stakes, the hearing, the settlement, the monthly payments that would continue for 40 years and then be renegotiated by Claire, who would handle the renegotiation the way Gerald had handled everything, with patience and precision, and the green notebook in the desk drawer, and the 1912 plat on the wall behind her, and the memory of her father's voice saying good when she swung the brush hook for the first time, and the sapling fell, and the sap darkened, and the April air smelled like cut wood and new beginnings. Time was the investment, and the return on the investment was not $4,100 a month. The return was the knowledge that the measurement was correct, that the line was where Gerald said it was, that the ground held what Gerald said it held, that the patience was justified, that June was right. The return was being right. Being right was enough. Being right had always been enough. Gerald Maddox had never needed more than being right, because being right was what a surveyor does, and a surveyor is what Gerald was, and a surveyor does not need the world to agree with his measurement in order for the measurement to be valid. The measurement is valid because the measurement is correct. The world's opinion of the measurement is irrelevant. The world can laugh in a courthouse basement, or write the word unfavorable on a loan application, or offer $8,000 or $45,000 or $420,000. The measurement does not change. The line does not move. The clause does not expire. The clause, 7 lines, linen paper, T.R. Fenton's careful hand, April 3rd, 1912, 115 years old. Still there, still valid, still perpetual, still sitting in its protective sleeve in the county archive, the most expensive piece of paper in the county's history, waiting for the next person who takes the time to read it. Gerald had been that person. Claire would tell others. Others would check their own maps. The clauses were in the books. The books were in the libraries. The libraries were open, and the ground beneath everything held what it held and remembered what it remembered, and did not change because the century changed, or the zoning changed, or the maps changed, or the plans of men changed, because the ground does not change. The ground is the ground. It was here before T.R. Fenton, and it will be here after the last book has crumbled, and the last entry has faded, and the last receipt has been lost, and the last porch light has burned out and been replaced, and burned out again, and been replaced again and again and again. Perpetual. The word that means forever. The word that means always. The word that means the ground holds and the line stays, and the right endures, and the patience pays, and the light stays on. Gerald Maddox knew this. He had always known it. From the fence post in January, to the porch light in October, to the notebook in April, to the hearing in June, to the silence in November, to the coffee in the morning, and to the crickets in the evening, to the gravel under the tires, to the fields in the sun, to the chair beside his chair, to the hand over the hand, to the voice in the kitchen, to the whistle of the kettle, to the shuffle of the slippers, to the turning of the pages, to the light through the window, to the ink on the paper, to the word on the page. Perpetual. And Gerald Maddox was home, and the porch light was on, and it was always on, and it always would be. Years from now, when Gerald Maddox is no longer sitting on the porch, and the chair beside June's chair is empty too, and the house on Sycamore Road has passed to Claire, the way the brush hook passed from Gerald's father to Gerald, and the way the claws will pass from Claire to whoever comes after Claire, a person will walk into the Mercer County Public Library on Elm Street and request Plat Book 19. The librarian will not be Mrs. Ewell. Mrs. Ewell retired in 2020, and the librarian after her, Garza, will have moved on by then, replaced by someone younger who has never heard of Gerald Maddox and does not know the significance of page 114, and will pull the book from the archive room without ceremony, the way Mrs. Ewell once pulled it without ceremony, because the book is a county record, and county records are available to the public, and the public does not need to justify its interest. The person will sit at the long oak table, the same table where Gerald sat every Tuesday for 2 years. The same chairs worn smoother now by another generation of hands, but fundamentally unchanged because oak does not change. It darkens. It acquires the patina of use, but it does not change. The ceiling fan will still be turning on its lowest setting, still producing a movement of air so faint that it can be detected only by the slight trembling of an open page, and the person will open Plat Book 19 to page 114 and will read 7 lines of handwritten ink in a slanting, careful hand that was trained in the 19th century by methods that no longer exist. And the ink will have faded further from weak tea to almost nothing but the protective sleeve, will have preserved it, and the words will still be legible if the reader holds the page to the light, the way Gerald held it in 1996, the way Claire held it in 2019, the way Judge Whitfield held it in the hearing room. And the person will read the word perpetual, and the person will understand, if the person has the patience to understand that the word means what it means and has meant what it means since April 3rd, 1912, and will mean what it means for as long as the English language exists to contain it, and for as long as the land exists beneath the buildings and the roads and the sidewalks and the fountains and the glass storefronts and the tree-lined walkways that were built upon it by men who did not check what lay beneath. Men who assumed the surface was all there was. Men who did not know that the ground holds secrets and that secrets have legal force, and that legal force does not expire because the men who created it have died. The person will close the book. The person will return it to the librarian. The person will walk out of the library into whatever kind of day is waiting, rain or sun, cold or warm, the kind of day that Gerald walked into 1,000 times during his life. The kind of day that does not announce itself as significant or historic or transformative, but that simply exists the way the ground exists, the way the clause exists, the way patience exists. And the clause will still be there on page 114. In its protective sleeve, 7 lines, 1 word, perpetual. The porch of the house on Sycamore Road will still have a light. Claire will have replaced the fixture once in 2031 when the old one finally corroded through, but she will have chosen the same style, the same shape, the same warm amber glow, because the light is not about the fixture. It is about the promise. The promise that June made in 1972, and that Gerald maintained after June died, and that Claire will maintain after Gerald dies, and that Claire's children will maintain after Claire if Claire has children, and if the children understand what the light means, which they will. Because Claire will tell them the way Gerald told Claire, not with words, but with the act of turning it on every evening and leaving it on every night and never explaining why. Because the act is the explanation and the explanation is the act. Come home. The house is occupied. Someone is here. And underneath the porch and underneath the house and underneath the gravel and underneath the fields and underneath the corridor and underneath the development and underneath the fountain and underneath the access road, the ground will hold what it has always held. The line, the right, the clause, the word. Written by a man with a pen in 1912 and read by a man with patience in 1996 and defended by a woman with a law degree in 2019 and maintained by a family with a brush hook for as many Aprils as the calendar can produce. The ground holds. The ground remembers. The ground does not check the maps that are drawn upon it. The ground does not verify the assumptions that are made about it. The ground does not confirm the title searches that are conducted above it. The ground simply holds what was placed upon it and waits for the person who is willing to look beneath the surface and read what is written there and stand on it and say, "This is mine and I have tended it and I have documented my tending and you cannot take it from me." Gerald Maddox was that person. Claire Maddox will be that person and after him. And whoever comes after Claire will be that person after her. Because the strip is perpetual. The clause is perpetual. The notebook will be filled and replaced and filled again. The brush hook will dull and be sharpened and dull and be sharpened. The stakes will be checked and driven and checked and driven. And every April, someone will walk 12 feet of earth from Route 9 to the river and clear the brush and record the date and close the notebook and walk home to a house where the light is on. That is the story, not the money, not the settlement, not the hearing or the banker's laugh, or the rejected loan or the second mortgage, or the 3 refusals or the sabotage or the photographs, or the judge holding linen paper to a window. Those are the events. The story is simpler than the events. The story is that a man showed up and kept showing up and did not stop showing up and documented every time he showed up, and that the documentation held and the patience paid and the ground remembered and the light stayed on. That is the story. And it is perpetual. And the porch light is on. And Gerald Maddox is home. Some men leave behind buildings. Some leave behind businesses or books or the accumulated reputation of a career spent in the public eye. Some leave behind nothing at all, their passage through the world, as traceless as a hand drawn through water, the surface closing behind them without a mark. Gerald Maddox would leave behind a green notebook, 27 pages of mechanical pencil entries that documented 27 years of showing up to a 12-foot strip of land in western Pennsylvania and doing the same thing every time, clearing the brush, checking the stakes, writing the date, and walking home. He would leave behind a framed receipt for $79.90. He would leave behind a filing cabinet beside a furnace organized by year, containing the complete documentary history of a man's patience converted into legal proof. He would leave behind a brush hook with a cracked ash handle and a newer one with a hickory handle and a hand plane sharpened every March and a cast iron vise bolted to a workbench in a barn that needed painting. He would leave behind a house with sound porch boards and clean gutters and tight weather stripping and a porch light that was on. And he would leave behind a clause. 7 lines of ink on linen paper written by a man named T.R. Fenton on April 3rd, 1912 in the county clerk's office on Main Street, Mercer, Pennsylvania. The clause granted a perpetual right of passage along a strip of land 12 feet wide and half a mile long, running northeast from Route 9 to the Mercer River. The clause was recorded in Plat Book 19 on page 114. The clause had been alive for 115 years when Gerald Maddox last walked the strip in April of his 77th year, and it would be alive for 115 more, and 115 after that, and so on, because the word perpetual does not contain a number, and does not acknowledge an ending, and does not recognize the passage of time as a force capable of altering its meaning. The clause would outlast the development. The clause would outlast the fountain and the access road and the glass-fronted buildings in the landscape plaza. The clause would outlast the 40-year easement agreement and whatever renegotiation followed it and whatever renegotiation followed that. The clause would outlast the courthouse where the hearing was held and the library where the plat book was stored and the house on Sycamore Road where the porch light was on. The clause would outlast every person who had ever read it or argued about it or profited from it or been defeated by it. The clause would outlast Gerald and Claire and Duff and Edna and Mrs. Ewell and Russell Flagg and Diane Ashford and Brent Harlow and Judge Whitfield and the senator who gave the ribbon-cutting speech and the architects who designed the buildings and the construction workers who built them and the tenants who occupied them and the customers who visited them and every other human being who had any connection, however slight, to the 12 feet of earth that a quiet man in a canvas jacket bought for the price of a good dinner on a Saturday morning in July, in a courthouse basement where a banker laughed and the fluorescent lights hummed and the air smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. The clause would outlast them all, because the clause was not about them. The clause was about the land, and the land does not end. Gerald Maddox knew this. He had known it since the first time he read page 114 under the slow ceiling fan in the limestone library on Elm Street, and he had carried the knowledge for 27 years, and the knowledge had sustained him through unemployment and poverty, and illness and loss, and the silence of a house that had once contained two voices, and now contained one, and the knowledge was not a comfort exactly, because comfort implies softness, and there was nothing soft about what Gerald knew. What Gerald knew was hard. What Gerald knew was bedrock. What Gerald knew was the ground beneath the surface, the truth beneath the assumption, the line beneath the map. The line was here. It had always been here, and it always would be. Gerald Maddox finished his coffee on a warm evening in the 27th year of his ownership of 1.7 acres of what the world once called swamp brush in a drainage ditch. He set the mug on the porch railing. He looked at the fields. He looked at the sky, which was the color of copper and rose and the particular luminous gold that appears for 7 minutes between sunset and dark, 7 minutes that Gerald watched every clear evening. Because the most valuable things are the things that do not last and must be seen while they are happening. He watched all 7 minutes. Then the light was gone, and the fields were dark, and the crickets took over, and the porch light hummed, and June's chair sat beside his, and Gerald Maddox, retired county surveyor owner of a perpetual right-of-way, patient man, steady man, who showed up and kept showing up and did not stop, was content. He stood. He went inside. He turned off the kitchen light, but not the porch light. The porch light stayed on, the way it always did, the way it always would. Perpetual. The morning after Gerald woke at 6 the way he always woke at 6, not to an alarm, but to the internal clock that had been calibrated by 50 years of early rising, and that no longer required external prompting, the way a church bell that has been rung at the same hour for decades would probably ring itself if nobody pulled the rope. The bedroom was cool. October light came through the curtain in a thin blade that fell across the foot of the bed and illuminated the quilt that June had bought from a woman in Greenville in 1989. A quilt with a log cabin pattern in blues and creams that June chose because she said it looked like something that had always existed rather than something that had been made, and Gerald understood what she meant, even though the distinction would have baffled most people. Because June's eye for objects was like Gerald's eye for terrain. She could read a thing's history in its surface the way he could read a parcel's history in its contours. He dressed, same order every morning, undershirt, then trousers, then belt, then socks, then boots. The boots took 90 seconds because of the double knotting. He did not rush. Rushing the boots would have been a concession to a world that was always in a hurry, and Gerald had stopped making concessions to that world 40 years ago at a fence line in Crawford County. He walked down the hall past the bathroom and the back bedroom where Claire slept on her visits and into the kitchen where the oak table sat under the window with the map still beneath the sugar bowl and the morning light beginning to reach across the surface toward the wall where the receipt hung in its frame. He filled the kettle, set it on the burner, turned the flame to medium-high, waited. 30 seconds after the boil, June's instruction. He had followed it for 3 years now without her here to verify compliance, and he would follow it for the rest of his years because the instruction was correct, and correctness does not require the presence of the person who established it. He poured. Black, no sugar. Same mug every morning, the one June chose for him when she finally won the 7-year campaign against the chip mug, a plain white ceramic mug with no stripe and no chip and no history, except the history Gerald was building into it one morning at a time, the way he built history into everything he touched, slowly through repetition, through the patient accumulation of use that transforms an object from a thing you own into a thing that owns part of you. He sat at the table. The light reached the receipt, $79.90. The numbers appeared through the glass the way they appeared every morning, steady and unchanged, the way the clause appeared on page 114, the way the line appeared on the map, the way the strip appeared in the landscape when you walked past the barn and through the fence break and stood at the southwest boundary and looked northeast toward the river along a corridor 12 feet wide and half a mile long that a man had been walking every April for 27 years. Gerald drank his coffee. He did not think about anything in particular. He looked through the window at the barn and the fields beyond, and the sky above the fields, which was this morning the color of polished steel, bright and hard and featureless, the kind of October sky that promises nothing and delivers exactly what it promises. He listened to the sounds of the house, the clock above the stove, the refrigerator, cycling the faint whistle under the barn door that he had fixed in 2021 and that had returned in 2024 because weather stripping has a lifespan, and the lifespan of weather stripping in a barn exposed to western Pennsylvania weather is approximately 3 years. A fact Gerald had now verified empirically, and that he would use to establish a replacement schedule going forward every 3 years January. Because a man who lets a gap remain when he knows the gap is there is a man who has stopped paying attention, and Gerald Maddox had never stopped paying attention to anything. The phone would ring at 7 on Wednesday. Claire, 10 minutes. How are you? Fine. The house? Fine. Duff is Duff, Saturday. Good. The recurrence was the meaning. The content was secondary. The call existed to confirm that the connection existed the way the porch light existed to confirm that the house was occupied, the way the April entry existed to confirm that the strip was maintained. Confirmation. That was what Gerald's life had become. A series of confirmations. The payment on the first confirmed the easement. The tax check in April confirmed the ownership. The notebook entry confirmed the maintenance. The call on Wednesday confirmed the daughter. The light on the porch confirmed the promise. Each confirmation was a measurement, and each measurement was a point on a line. And the line extended forward into a future that Gerald could not see, but that he trusted to exist, because the line had been extending for 27 years and had not yet deviated and showed no sign of deviating, because the line was built on a word that did not deviate. Perpetual. Gerald rinsed his mug, set it upside down, checked the stove, checked the lock, walked to the front door, opened it, stepped onto the porch. The morning was clear. The fields were bright. The gravel was dry. The barn was quiet. The machines in the corridor had not yet started. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the birds and the wind and the faint, distant rumble of a truck on Route 9, which might have been a delivery truck or a county truck or a truck carrying materials to the Mercer Quarter development. A truck that would cross the 12-foot strip without its driver knowing that the crossing costs $4,100 a month, indexed to inflation, transferable to heirs, payable for the remaining duration of a 40-year term, because the driver did not need to know. The driver's job was to drive. The knowing was Gerald's job. The knowing had always been Gerald's job, and Gerald had done it well. He sat in his chair. The chair had been in this position on this porch for 30 years. The legs had worn shallow depressions in the porch board's quarter-inch grooves that matched the diameter of the chair legs exactly, because 30 years of a man's weight concentrated through 4 points of contact will depress even pressure-treated lumber, slowly, imperceptibly, 1 fraction of a millimeter per season, until the depressions become permanent features of the surface evidence of presence, proof of occupancy, the porch equivalent of the notebook entries that documented 27 years of showing up. June's chair sat in its own depressions, slightly shallower than Gerald's because June weighed less, but present, measurable, real. The depressions would remain in the porch boards for as long as the boards remained, which would be approximately 15 years, given the replacement schedule Gerald had established, at which point Claire would face a choice: replace the boards and lose the depressions, or keep the boards and accept the wear. Gerald did not know which she would choose. He did not need to know. The choice was hers. The boards were the boards. The depressions were the record. And the record, like all records, would eventually be overwritten by the next record, which was the nature of surfaces, which is why Gerald had always trusted the ground beneath the surface more than the surface itself, because surfaces change and the ground does not. The ground. Always the ground. The ground beneath the porch, and the ground beneath the gravel, and the ground beneath the fields, and the ground beneath the corridor, and the ground beneath the strip. The same ground, connected, continuous, unbroken. Stretching from Gerald's front door to Route 9 to the 12-foot strip to the Mercer River. All of it one surface, one piece of earth, one fact that had been true since before the first human being stood on it, and that would be true after the last human being left it, because the ground is the ground is the ground. And the ground does not require human beings to verify its existence, or to maintain its integrity, or to record its dimensions. Though Gerald had done all three for 27 years, out of respect and out of duty, and out of the particular stubbornness that Duff Kinney had once called a flaw, and later called a virtue, and that June had called both things in the same breath, and that was in the end. Neither a flaw nor a virtue, but simply the thing that made Gerald Maddox who he was, a man who did not stop. He did not stop at the fence line in January. He did not stop at the termination letter in March. He did not stop at the library card in April. He did not stop at the plat book in February. He did not stop at the auction in July. He did not stop at the first offer or the second offer or the third offer. He did not stop at the illness or the mortgage or the sabotage or the motion or the hearing. He did not stop at the settlement. He did not stop at the first payment. He did not stop when June died. He did not stop when the silence filled the house. He did not stop when the crossword sat on the table unfinished for 6 months. He did not stop when the house coat hung on the hook. He did not stop. He showed up. He measured. He recorded. He waited. He showed up again. He measured again. He recorded again. He waited again. 27 times, 27 Aprils. 27 entries in a green notebook with a mechanical pencil that did not fade, written by a hand that did not waver. Documenting a commitment that did not lapse. Defending a right that did not expire. And the right did not expire because the word that created it was perpetual. And the man who defended it was patient. And the patience was not a virtue. The patience was a material, as real as stone, as useful as steel, something you could hold in your hand and build with one April at a time, one tax payment at a time, one notebook entry at a time until the structure was complete and the measurement was correct and the line was established and the ground remembered and the light was on and the coffee was done and the morning was good and the man was home. Gerald Maddox looked at the fields. The light was changing. The steel-colored sky was softening at the eastern edge, admitting a pale gold that would spread across the hills and down the slopes and over the fields and onto the strip. His strip, the 12 feet of earth that had been the axis of his life, and that would continue to be the axis of his family's life for as long as the clause remained, which was forever, which was perpetual, which was the only word that mattered. He drank his coffee. He set down the mug. He breathed. The air smelled like October wood smoke and dry leaves and cold ground and the particular clarity that comes when summer has exhausted itself and the atmosphere has been scrubbed clean by the first frosts and everything that remains is essential, stripped of excess, reduced to what it actually is rather than what it appears to be in the green abundance of summer, when everything is growing and nothing is visible because growth obscures the structure beneath it. October was Gerald's favorite month. He had never told anyone this. It was not the kind of thing he considered worth telling, but it was true. October was when the structure showed. When the trees dropped their leaves and the fields went brown and the land revealed itself, its actual contours, its drainage patterns, its property lines visible again as fence rows and hedgerows and the subtle variations in soil color that told you where one parcel ended and another began. October was when Gerald could look at the landscape and see what he spent every other month of the year remembering from memory the shape of the ground, the truth beneath the surface. He had lived his entire life in October, not the calendar month, the principle, the stripping away, the revelation of structure, the willingness to see what is actually there rather than what appears to be there, to read the ground rather than the map, to check the old records rather than trusting the new ones, to look beneath the assumption and find the fact. Gerald Maddox, 77, retired, widowed, patient, home. The porch light above him, glowing amber in the morning light, redundant and indispensable, burning through the daylight, the way it burned through the dark, the way it had burned since 1972, the way it would burn tomorrow and the day after and the year after and the decade after, perpetual. The way June intended it, the way Gerald maintained it, the way Claire would inherit it. And the strip, out there past the barn, through the fence break, 12 feet wide, half a mile long, cleared in April, growing now. The box elders and the black cherries reaching for the sky, the annual rush of growth that would be cut back next spring by a man with a brush hook who would open a notebook and write the date and close the notebook and walk home to a house where the porch light was on. 28th year coming, 28th April, 28th entry. Gerald would be there. The way he was always there. The way the ground was always there. The way the clause was always there. The way the light was always on. Perpetual.